The process of losing someone close to you often feels like losing part of yourself. One moment, you're spending all your time together, and the next, you're left with a million things to say, but no one to say them to. It's as if they take all your joy and warmth with them, leaving you to wander through life in a cold, empty world. In that emptiness, you occasionally wonder if it would be easier to join them in death, to be reunited with the person you lost. My older brother and I were always inseparable. As kids, we were as close as two people could be, sharing everything and finding comfort in each other's presence. We spent most of our childhood in a small town in Washington, where my parents owned a large piece of land with a dense forest right behind the house. Every day, my brother and I would wander into the woods, pretending to be knights, building forts out of sticks, and laying siege to each other's castles. Those were the happiest memories I have of us. As we grew older, we drifted apart. My brother spent more time with his girlfriends, while I focused on school and my part-time job. We stopped talking as much, and the space between us grew. Neither of us acknowledged the distance that was forming, and I still regret not trying to fix it. During my last year of high school, I got caught up in studying for final exams. The pressure of schoolwork made me neglect almost everything else, including my relationships. Although I had friends, they were just as busy with their studies as I was. Socializing was out of the question. That was until my brother invited me to a graduation party. It was a gathering for seniors, but he offered to let me come along. Normally, I would have said no, but this time I decided to go. I figured it would be a good way to reconnect with him. "Finally going to try your luck with the girls?" he teased when I agreed. I replied, "I'm just going to keep you out of trouble. You handle the flirting." My brother smiled and gave me a knowing look. "Make sure you clear your evening," he said before heading off. The idea of spending my Saturday night at a party full of drunk teenagers didn't excite me, but I knew it was important to my brother. I didn't want to disappoint him. The week leading up to the party flew by as I focused on my homework. Saturday morning, my brother woke me up late, grinning as I scrambled to get ready. "Wakey, wakey, sleepyhead. It's 11 o'clock. I want to make sure my little bro is ready for tonight," he said, patting my head. I grumbled, "I hate you, man." He laughed and left me to get dressed. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the house as I went downstairs. My mom was cooking and smiled at me as I sat down. "What's the occasion?" I asked. She looked up. "It's been a while since you two spent some time together. Thought I'd make it special." I felt guilty. Things get busy. School, work. I can't do it all, I muttered. "It's good that you're making an effort now," she said, placing the plate in front of me. As the day wore on, I started second-guessing the idea of going. I feared my brother would leave me behind at the party and disappear into the crowd of drunk teens. But I shoved the thought aside. I was doing this for him. I dressed in a leather jacket, denim jeans, and a muscle tee. When my brother saw me, he raised an eyebrow. Well, look at you. If you give it a shot, the ladies will be all over you," he teased. I rolled my eyes. "Enough with the compliments. Let's go." It was a cold evening as we left the house. The chilly air hit us like a wall. We hopped into my old Camaro, and as we drove down winding roads, the pavement eventually turned to dirt. By 7 p.m., we arrived at the house where the party was being held. My brother's friend, Howard, greeted us at the door and invited us in. It was 1985, and the rules about underage drinking weren't as strictly enforced where we lived. Within the hour, the yard was full of people, and the party was in full swing. I played a few rounds of blackjack and even refereed a drinking contest that my brother, predictably, lost. As the party wound down, most of the guests left. My brother, who had drunk more than he should, was slurring his words and having trouble standing. "I'm going to help clean up," I said, as Howard and I started picking up the mess. My brother collapsed onto the couch, holding his head. After we finished, I helped my brother to his feet, and we prepared to leave. But Howard stopped us. Just because the party's over doesn't mean the fun has to stop. There's an old, abandoned mansion just down the road. People say it's haunted. Want to check it out? I hesitated. My brother was too drunk to be walking through the woods in the middle of the night, and the idea of going into a decaying mansion was not appealing. But before I could protest, my brother, clearly eager for some adventure, slurred, "Sure, I'll go. Haunted or not, I'm in." I objected. "It's late, and we have curfew. Mom's going to kill us." But my brother wasn't listening. He turned to Howard. "Let's go." Knowing I couldn't stop them, I reluctantly agreed, and we piled back into my car. Howard directed me to the mansion, which was deep in the woods, far off the main road. The streetlights grew scarcer as we approached. Finally, we came to a set of rusty iron gates covered in vines. As we approached the gates, I noticed there had once been initials welded into the metal, but they were gone now. "Ready to see some ghosts?" Howard asked with a mischievous grin. I shrugged. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I wasn't going to back out now. My brother seemed sober enough to walk, but there was a nervous edge to him. Howard led the way, pushing open the gates with a loud creak that sent a chill down my spine. We ventured into the overgrown grass, pushing through the thick bushes. Soon, the dark shape of the mansion appeared before us. It looked just as I had imagined, decaying and forgotten. But there was something unsettling about the stillness that surrounded it. Howard pushed ahead, trying the front door, but it was locked. After a few failed attempts to open it, he decided to kick it in. The door crashed open, and we stepped inside. The interior was bizarrely clean, not a speck of dust in sight. The furniture was well kept, and the floors gleamed. It looked as if the family who had lived here never left. My brother and I exchanged confused glances, but before we could speak, we heard something from upstairs, a soft sobbing. Howard, determined to investigate, whispered, "We've got to check this out. Someone could be hurt." My heart raced as I followed them up the stairs. The sobbing grew louder. We reached the top of the stairs and found ourselves at a long hallway. Howard led the way, and as we approached the end, the crying intensified. The door at the end of the hall was closed, and I tried to convince Howard not to open it. But he ignored me, twisting the knob and pushing the door open. The sobbing stopped instantly, and an eerie silence filled the air. I shone my flashlight into the room, and what I saw will haunt me forever. A creature was lying on the floor, its skeletal frame twisted in unnatural proportions. Its arms were long and claw-like, and its hair was a tangled mess. Its spine jutted out from its back, and it was impossibly thin. It was like nothing I had ever seen, and for a moment, I couldn't process it. The creature shifted, its chest rising and falling violently, as if it was suffocating. Then, to my horror, it began to laugh. Its neck snapped as it turned its head, revealing its grotesque face. The eyes were dark and lifeless, and its mouth was stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. It was taller than any of us, its body bending in disturbing ways. My brother, shaking with fear, grabbed me and pulled me down the stairs. I stumbled after him, and we ran outside, pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the thorns that tore at us. We made it back to my car, and I started the engine just as my brother slid in beside me. As we sped away, my headlights briefly illuminated the creature, perched on top of the gates, its mouth dripping with blood. But it didn't follow us. We drove home in silence, the weight of what we had seen hanging over us. When we got back, Howard quickly disappeared into his house. Neither my brother nor I spoke. I switched on the radio, trying to ease the tension with music. The days that followed were a blur. My brother graduated and moved on to college. I finished my junior year with honors, but the memory of that night stayed with me. That summer, my brother fell ill. What started as a mild ache grew worse, and soon he couldn't even get out of bed. Doctors couldn't diagnose him, but nurses at the hospital said he often talked about a tall woman haunting. My wife Sam wanted me to share this story with you. She listens to the podcast and thought it would be interesting for others to hear what a real-life scary experience was like when I was around 12 years old. Back then, I lived in a small town near Asheville, North Carolina, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. This was in the early 70s, and back then, people didn't worry the way they do now. We'd go out all day and only come back when the sun set. There was less concern for safety, and we didn't have the constant distractions of today's world. We'd explore the woods, find old mines and caves, and camp outside during warm summer nights. There were no gaming consoles and television stations were limited, so we didn't spend much time at home. Looking back, we did some reckless things and took big risks that could have ended badly, but somehow we made it through. The story starts early one morning when I, along with my siblings, was waiting for the school bus. It was about 7 a.m. on a chilly November day, sometime in the mid-70s. Suddenly, we noticed the gravel on the road moving. We heard rocks tumbling, and dirt and dust rose from a nearby ridge. This went on for a few seconds, enough to send us running back into the house. The radio in my dad's old car mentioned a 7.3 magnitude earthquake in a place called Claiborne County, to the north. I remember my dad saying it was felt all the way to Charlotte, North Carolina, about 100 miles south. We ended up missing school that day, which we thought was great, so we did what we usually did, headed out into the woods to explore. We made our way to the ridge where the ground had shifted, hoping to see which rocks had fallen. Along the way, we stumbled across a cave entrance that had been exposed. Real caves, especially the ones not meant for tourists, don't look like the ones in pictures or movies. This one was covered with roots, leaves, and dirt, but it was still visible enough to see inside. We headed back to the house, grabbed some rope and an old lantern from my dad's shed, and soon returned to the cave. We were nervous but excited, hoping we might find gold, diamonds, or maybe even turn it into a secret hideout. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Dale, and the twin brothers who lived next door. The twins were always causing trouble and swearing, but they were entertaining to be around. Dale and I had been best friends for as long as I could remember. We climbed down the embankment to the cave's entrance, turned on the lantern, and started clearing away the roots and leaves to make space. When I stuck my head inside, I was instantly hit with a thick, unpleasant smell of decay. I gagged but didn't let it stop me. I pulled my shirt over my nose and crawled in. Dale handed me the lantern, and as I shone it around, I saw a low, flat room about 4 feet high and at least 20 feet wide. The cave stretched further back, but my light couldn't reach that far. Dale crawled in after me, followed by the twins, holding the lantern as high as they could. As we ventured deeper, we saw bones scattered all over the floor. Cats, dogs, deer, and small animals. Some of the bones were clean, while others still had bits of meat clinging to them. Then one of the twins found a dog collar. We realized that these bones likely belonged to animals, possibly even pets that had wandered into the cave. As we explored further, I spotted 2 glowing lights in the back of the cave, reflecting our lantern. It didn't make a sound, but the feeling was unsettling. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. I kept my eyes fixed on the lights. Dale must have noticed my anxiety because he followed my gaze. Without another word, we scrambled to get out of the cave. It could only be one thing, a bear's den. Once we were outside, we raced back to the house and told my dad what we'd seen. He was getting ready to head to his second shift at the factory in town. He told us to stay away from that cave until he could check it out. My mom overheard us and threatened to punish us if we went back out there. The idea of getting mauled by a bear was enough to make us agree to stay put. To keep us busy, Dad gave us some chores, splitting firewood and breaking coal. So our adventurous day ended there. The rest of the week was uneventful except for news about the earthquake, which everyone was talking about. By the weekend, Dale and I had decided we were going back to the cave. We were determined to find out if a bear really lived there. It wasn't the smartest decision, but we went prepared with pocket knives and sticks, thinking they might protect us. We climbed back up the hill to the cave. A recent rainstorm had washed away some of the mud, making the entrance bigger and easier to get in and out of. We pushed past the still-present stench of decay and made our way deeper into the cave. The passage narrowed until we reached a steep slope. We continued down and found no animal bones in this part, but after 100 feet we came across a large hole in the ground. The strangest part was that we could feel warm air rising from it. We didn't have enough rope to explore further, so we made our way back out. But our curiosity was still strong, so we lit some makeshift torches using the lantern and headed back inside. We dropped one of the torches down the hole. It hit the bottom after about 20 feet, landing in a room with a dirt-covered floor. But then we heard a low growl, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It sounded like a big cat, maybe a lion or tiger. Then came the scream. The noise was deafening, and we dropped our gear, covering our ears. With the torchlight, we saw the creature circling below us. It looked like a mountain lion, but its fur was as black as night. Its ears were tall and pointed, like a Doberman's, and its eyes glowed red. It stared at us, making it clear that it was deciding who to kill first. Then it screamed again, and the noise was so powerful, it knocked me to my knees. My head felt like it was being struck by a bell, and I couldn't think or move. I felt weak and sick. Dale collapsed beside me, also covering his ears. He dropped the lantern and it rolled down into the hole. It went dark at the top, but the bottom of the hole burst into light when the lantern shattered. The creature screamed again, this time in pain. That's when our survival instincts kicked in. We ran. We scrambled up the slope, knowing that whatever that creature was, it was coming for us. We reached the cave's entrance just as the scream echoed again. This time, it hit us like a blast of water from a fire hose. We tumbled forward, barely making it out. We ran all the way home, tears streaming down our faces. Neither of us could hear for a week, and I had a headache so bad that my parents took me to the doctor. He couldn't find anything wrong, but suggested that the cave's gases were likely causing our symptoms. After a week, the ringing in my ears finally stopped. I had strange dreams for months. Dreams where I was back in that cave, with that creature screaming at me. I'd wake up curled into a ball just like before. I think Dale had the same dreams. We never went back to that cave. We were scared, and even though it wasn't like us to give up, we never had the courage to return. Not long after, my family moved away, and Dale and I lost touch. Years later, I heard there was another earthquake, so I went back to see if the cave was still there. It was, but part of the roof had collapsed. I tried to find Dale, but he had moved away too. The twins who worked at the local garage told me that Dale had stayed in the area for a while. He'd never quite gotten over what happened. Eventually, he was sent to a special school for the deaf, and when he returned, he was a quiet person who kept to himself. He worked at the mill for a while, but didn't make many friends. I'm not sure what that earthquake opened up back then, and I guess I'll never know. But one thing I do know is that what we encountered that day was no ordinary animal. It had the power to use its scream to paralyze its prey, or maybe even its enemies. I've never encountered anything like it since. With Mount Hoboken from Mike's Ridge tucked deep within the untamed hills of Tennessee, My home rests in a place of secrets, hidden far from the world. Endless valleys, steep cliffs, and vast forests stretch beyond the state line, concealing a rich history unknown to most. The story I'm about to share uncovers one of these hidden tales. Within this remote wilderness lies an area of forest-covered peaks known to locals as Hoboken Mountain. But to those who have lived here for generations, it's referred to as the forest that takes. This place carries an air of mystery, echoing a story that goes beyond mere names, reaching deep into an ancient past buried beneath the mountains and cliffs, which seem to stretch on forever. Long ago, settlers pushed farther into unknown territories, drawn by the allure of the land now known as Hoboken Mountain. Detailed surveys revealed a region teeming with wildlife, rich in resources, and fertile ground promising plentiful harvests. This land not only fulfilled their immediate needs, but also became a strategic point for future settlements. The colonists, dreaming of prosperity, saw Hoboken Mountain as more than just land. It was the key to unlocking the untapped potential of their growing community. At the time, the indigenous people and the colonists had a peaceful coexistence. However, as news spread that the settlers intended to settle near Hoboken Mountain, tensions began to rise. The natives, instead of becoming hostile, took a more cautious approach, fearing a disturbance to the land. They warned the newcomers, urging them to avoid the area, sharing tales steeped in fear and superstition. Despite the warnings, the settlers, driven by their ambition, pushed forward with their plans, continuing to build their settlement. Occasional skirmishes with native groups and sabotage fueled by fear of the so-called cursed land did little to halt their progress. Eventually, the settlers established their town, laying the groundwork for the area's future. Over the years, various stories have circulated about the settlement's struggles, but none have been verified. These tales often speak of misfortune, strange afflictions, and mysterious disappearances. Despite the lack of evidence, the consensus is that the settlement was ultimately abandoned, swallowed by the encroaching forest. Today, locals still advise against venturing into these woods. While not everyone heeds the warning, any experienced hunter will tell you the unspoken truth: never go alone. The unwritten rule for Hoboken Mountain is clear: always travel in pairs, never alone. In the summer of 1997, I foolishly ignored that rule. While the Amazon is often called the Green Inferno, those who know the Tennessee mountains would argue it's the real Green Inferno. The dense woods and towering peaks make it easy to lose your bearings. Raised in these forests, I'd hunted the mountains for years, but that summer marked my first solo trip. Initially planned with 3 friends, unforeseen circumstances left me to go alone. Despite my better judgment and a misplaced confidence, I ventured in, parking my truck at the end of the dirt road and beginning my hike. Standing at the edge, where the forest met the trail, it felt as if the forest held its breath, waiting for me to cross into its depths. The first part of the hike was lively with birds, squirrels, and the usual sounds of nature, but as I pressed deeper into the woods, something began to feel off. Despite knowing the terrain well, I felt disconnected from my surroundings, as if something was watching me. Around 30 minutes into my journey, I paused, sitting on a rock to sip coffee from my thermos. It was then that I noticed a few drops of blood on a nearby leaf. As I looked closer, I saw a small cut on my arm. The scene took an unsettling turn when a swarm of butterflies descended, landing on the leaf and battling to feed on the blood. I found myself mesmerized by the strange sight when suddenly, a loud snap broke the silence. I turned, but there was nothing. When I looked back, the butterflies and blood were gone. I shook off the eerie feeling and continued my hike, eventually reaching a clearing near a stream where we had set up a deer stand years before. The area was peaceful, a perfect spot to wait for deer. Within the hour, a large buck appeared in the clearing. I raised my rifle, peering through the scope, But before I could take the shot, the buck suddenly jerked its head toward the treeline and bolted. I swung the scope to follow the movement and saw a blur in the bushes, a pinkish shape that slowly emerged. What appeared was beyond horrifying. Standing in the clearing was a naked, dirt-covered version of myself, staring up at me with a twisted, menacing grin. I froze, heart racing. Lowering the rifle, I tried to focus on the figure through my naked eyes, hoping to clear any distortion from the scope. But before I could fully adjust, the figure vanished. I stood frozen in place, the once vibrant forest now silent and oppressive. I felt a growing sense of dread, as if something was hunting me, much like the buck I had just missed. Without warning, a deep, guttural roar echoed from the depths of the forest. Panic surged, and I turned and ran. The woods, once so familiar, now felt like a labyrinth, closing in around me. I covered the 2-hour hike in less than half the time, gasping for breath. When I finally emerged onto the dirt road, I stumbled toward my truck, hands pressed against the hood for support. In the corner of my eye, I saw a large, dark shape move behind a tree, and then a grotesque hand, human in form, clung to the bark before disappearing. I rushed to my truck, quickly driving away, leaving the mountain behind. What I encountered that day was unlike anything I've ever experienced. Though I struggle to understand or accept what happened, I'll share this. The world holds ancient secrets, and in forgotten corners of the earth, these mysteries may still stir. Beware the old places with old stories. Sometimes they are very much alive. My foster aunt enrolled her son in a private school known for its outstanding extracurricular activities. He decided to join the Scouts, a group where students participated in weekly outdoor tasks to advance in rank and earn badges. One morning, the Scouts, both boys and girls, were assigned to walk around a small forest, taking photos at certain checkpoints to prove they'd completed the designated route. The boys were grouped into threes with other boys, and the girls did the same. The group my foster aunt's son was in was always asked to walk ahead of the girls' group, followed by another set of boys, and then another set of girls, alternating genders. Each trio was about 50 meters apart. On this particular morning, as they walked along, he noticed a man in bright red jogging pants standing silently near the farthest edge of the forest, watching them. He didn't think much of it, assuming the jogger was just exercising, as it wasn't unusual to see people in the woods at that hour. He figured the jogger was simply observing them out of curiosity. After completing the first round, their scout leader was pleased with their quick work and offered them the chance to earn more badges if they could complete 2 more laps. The scouts agreed, and they set off again, following the same formation. When they neared the edge of the woods again, my foster aunt's son realized the jogger in red pants was still standing in the same spot, staring at them in complete silence. This time, the other boys in his group also saw him, and they wondered if they should take a photo to show their scout leader. But since it was a public place frequented by joggers, they decided to ignore him, not wanting to stir up trouble. On the third and final lap, as they neared the same spot again, they avoided looking at the jogger, trying to ignore the uncomfortable situation. When they were about 30 meters away, they suddenly heard a loud, frantic scream behind them. They turned to see a girl running toward them in terror, her mouth open in fear. The boys, assuming something was seriously wrong, immediately sprinted toward their school. Once they arrived, they rushed to their scout leader, who demanded to know what had happened. One of the girls, pale and trembling, explained that as she and her friends approached the edge of the forest, a man had jumped in front of them, touching himself while grinning in a disturbing way. His red track pants were pulled down, and the girls, horrified, ran away as fast as they could. Soon, more boys and girls arrived at the school, having heard the girls' screams. They had all run to the spot where the screams had come from, but the man was gone. They decided to stick together for safety and finish their walk quickly. The scout leader immediately contacted the police, who searched the forest and surrounding areas for the man in red pants, but they found no trace of him. After taking statements from the scouts who had seen him, the police concluded that he was likely an opportunistic predator, waiting for the right moment and the right targets. By watching the scouts complete their rounds, he had known the girls would be isolated, and he took advantage of the situation before escaping. Although the scouts were supposed to finish their activity by the afternoon, the incident caused everyone to stay at school until late evening while the police conducted briefings on safety and issued an alert for the man. My foster aunt's son continued with his scouting activities until he left for college a few years later. From what he heard, the man in red pants was never caught, nor was he seen again in the area. However, due to the incident, all of the school's future outdoor activities had to be supervised by at least 3 adults. Many parents volunteered to chaperone and even offered to fund extra security at particularly busy events. This story takes place in the summer of 2015. I've lived in the mountains of northeast Pennsylvania for most of my life. I've spent many years hunting, fishing, and camping in these wild areas, and I've been fortunate to see almost all the wildlife that the state has to offer. However, I'm also convinced that there are things out there that we humans don't fully understand. My ex-wife, whose name I'll leave out for privacy, grew up in the city of Trenton, New Jersey, and had never been camping before. Wanting her to experience the country life, my family arranged a camping weekend in my parents' backyard. We weren't exactly roughing it, though. We stayed in a pop-up camper, only about 25 yards away from my parents' house. Despite that, the weekend was lovely, filled with fishing, hiking, swimming, and campfires with toasted marshmallows. It was just me, my family, my ex-wife, and our 2 lab mix dogs, Yoshi and Max. After spending 2 nights in the camper, we were preparing for the final night. My father, a hardworking, no-nonsense man, warned us about an incoming storm. We laughed it off, looking forward to the sound of the rain hitting the camper roof as we slept. We all said our good nights and settled the dogs down before going to sleep. My ex-wife and I talked briefly about how nice the weekend had been before falling asleep quickly, exhausted from a full day of swimming. Around midnight, I woke up to the camper rocking gently. It was hard to tell the exact time, but the room was pitch black, and I could hear distant thunder. I tried to go back to sleep, but the thunder grew louder, shaking the camper. My wife and I both sat up in alarm, and the dogs started barking frantically. The rain started pouring down hard, almost like bullets hitting the roof. We had just started talking about what to do when we heard fast footsteps running down the stone path from the house to the camper. We assumed it was my parents, coming to warn us to move inside. "Papa Bear?" my ex-wife called out as the dogs growled. Yoshi, a 125-pound lab mix, quickly hid under the table, along with the more nervous Max. Suddenly, something slammed into the camper door with enough force to rock it. We both screamed as the camper leaned to one side, like something heavy was pulling on it. A loud bang came from the roof, as if something had jumped up onto it. Despite the storm, the yard light didn't come on, and the dogs were barking nonstop while my wife sobbed in fear. In the dark, I whispered a plan. "I'll send the dogs out first, then I'll follow. When I tell you, run to the house and don't stop for anything." She nodded in fear, and I flung open the door, shouting, "Yoshi, Max, go!" The dogs bolted out of the camper as I scrambled out after them. Armed only with a hatchet my dad used for the campfire, I ran after the dogs, keeping my eyes on the dark yard. The motion-sensing lights finally flickered on, revealing the yard soaked in rain, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I looked around in horror, expecting to see whatever had attacked the camper. But the yard was empty, with only rain and wind around me. To my shock, I saw my father, still in his pajamas, being pulled by my mother onto the back porch. Whatever had been on top of the camper was gone, and the small patch of trees surrounding the camper had no low branches. If something had dropped from them, I would have heard it, but there was nothing. I rushed inside and told my parents what had happened. My dad didn't believe in the supernatural or anything unusual. He brushed it off as a large raccoon, and I was scolded for being scared of tree animals. However, he agreed to look into it in the morning. Needless to say, neither of us got any sleep that night, but the dogs seemed perfectly fine. At daybreak, we went outside. I repeated my story and showed my dad that the camper was solid. It didn't sway when I jumped on it. I tried rocking it myself using all my strength. At 6 feet 1 inch and 230 pounds, I couldn't budge it. The scariest moment came when my dad got a ladder to check the roof. Above the camper door, there were 4 long marks in the algae, like fingerprints. "Dad, just look at those marks," I said, pointing at the clear indentations. "These fingers are over 7 inches long." He just shook his head and walked back inside without another word. Now I'm sure it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a raccoon. I still don't know what exactly visited us that summer night, but I'm grateful it didn't stick around. This is a story about what I experienced while hunting in the dense woods of the Appalachian region of West Virginia. The incident took place 4 years ago during the rifle season of 2019, when I was 20 years old, about to turn 21. As a birthday gift, my dad decided to join me on a hunting trip. I was excited about this since he's always so busy, and I don't get to spend much time with him, so I was really looking forward to the trip. I spent the whole week preparing for the hunt and went to bed that night full of anticipation. But the next morning, I received an unexpected call from my mom. "Hey, honey," she said, using honey instead of my real name for privacy. "Your dad's come down with something and won't be able to make it today." Naturally, I felt disappointed, but despite that, I decided to go hunting anyway. I'd spent the whole week getting ready, so I figured it would be a waste not to go. I grabbed my rifle, hopped into my truck, and made my way out to my stand. When I got settled, it was still completely dark. I decided to rest my eyes for a bit since, for those who don't hunt, the best time to get into the stand is before dawn when the deer are still hunkered down, and you don't risk scaring them away. I was sitting there with my eyes closed when I began hearing footsteps. I was puzzled, as these steps were bipedal but seemed much heavier and unnatural. I'd grown up in these woods, and my parents used to joke about me acting like a boy because I spent so much time outside. I was no stranger to the sounds of the forest, so this was definitely unusual. Suddenly, I heard my dad's voice echo from the darkness. "Hey, I've come to hunt with you. Where are you?" I froze. My dad was a jokester and would usually sneak up on me, or simply find where I was without asking. He knew the area well, and we always hunted in the same spot. We'd never changed its location because it was perfect for spotting both bucks and does. But this voice sounded wrong. Lifeless, flat, almost like a recording. It didn't sound like my dad at all. I stayed as still as possible, keeping my eyes wide open and scanning the dark woods. A deep sense of dread began to wash over me. I had heard stories of creatures that could mimic voices, like skinwalkers or wendigos. My heart started to race as I realized I might be dealing with something far more dangerous than I could handle. If I was discovered, there was no way I'd outrun it. My rifle felt useless in my hands. Then my worst fear came to life. A dark, shadowy figure appeared in front of me. It had long, unnatural limbs that brushed the ground as it moved, its heavy steps crunching through the fallen leaves of autumn. The figure was searching for me, repeating the same words. "I've come to hunt with you. Where are you?" I stayed motionless in my stand long after the figure had passed. I waited until daylight before climbing down and heading back to my truck. As I made my way through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing branches snapping behind me, and it felt like hours before I finally reached my vehicle. When I climbed in and started the truck, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A pale, tall figure stood behind a tree. Its eyes locked on me as I drove away. Then, it let out an inhuman, furious scream. My heart pounded as I instinctively covered my ears, losing control of the steering wheel for a moment before I yanked it sharply to the right to avoid slamming into a tree. I quickly drove home, my mind racing. Once I was back, I tried to process everything that had happened. It hasn't stopped me from loving the woods, though, and I still hunt that area to this day. I never saw anything like that again, and my dad did end up getting better after having a rough time with illness. The following year, we went hunting together as planned. I've never shared this story before because my parents always laughed when I brought up creepy topics, but writing it down now feels like a weight is finally being lifted. If I can offer any advice, it's this. No matter how well you think you know your hunting grounds, there are things out there that might make you reconsider everything you thought you understood about the woods. This happened when I was 19, spending part of the summer at my Uncle Buck's house. He lives on a farm with over 100 acres of land and a bunch of animals, including dogs, horses, and even a pet deer he found when it was just a baby after its mother was killed. One day, I decided to go horseback riding with my cousin Jake. I was riding a horse named Trent Malloy, which was named after a character from the show Walker, Texas Ranger. Jake was on his horse, Lady B, with his dog Rory, a border collie husky mix, tagging along. We were riding along when we both suddenly felt like we were being watched. Jake called Rory over, and the dog jumped onto his lap. Then we heard a twig snap to our left. We both looked over, and I kid you not, we saw someone wearing a mask like Michael Myers from Halloween. Jake and I exchanged terrified looks, and before we could even say anything, Rory started growling towards the right. We turned to look and saw another person in a mask like Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th. At this point, we were both scared and confused. The men then pulled out knives. We couldn't tell if they were real, but we didn't want to stick around to find out. Jake and I quickly turned the horses around, signaling for them to run. Jake held onto the reins with one hand and had his other arm around Rory. I looked back and saw the men chasing us. Just as we were nearly back to Uncle Buck's house, I saw a knife fly past us. Over the sound of the horse's hooves, Jake yelled, "What are these freaks doing?" That's when gunshots rang out. We were almost at the house when we saw Uncle Buck running toward us with a shotgun in hand, followed by his neighbor, Joe, and Joe's son, Kyle, both carrying baseball bats. The men in the costumes stopped at the fence after we got through it. Uncle Buck yelled for them to get down on the ground, and they complied. Jake ran inside and called the police. When they arrived, they took off the masks and revealed two men. The men told the officers they only wanted to scare someone, but the police weren't buying that excuse. They were charged with attempted murder and are currently in prison. If Rory hadn't been with us that day, we probably would have never noticed the other person. And if we hadn't had the horses, we might not have been able to outrun them. Sadly, Rory passed away a year later from old age. It was tough on Jake, as Rory was his favorite dog, but he's doing better now. He and his dad have 20 other dogs, and there's a litter of pups expected in March. But that day we'll never forget. This is a story I heard from a friend of mine, and it will be told from her point of view. She had been hiking in the remote forests of Ohio, just taking a quiet nature walk. At the time, marijuana wasn't fully legal in Ohio. I'm not sure if it is now, but back then, you had to venture about 10 miles into the woods to be out of sight if you wanted to enjoy some. She had just lit up and was soaking in the sights and sounds around her when, out of nowhere, she heard something coming from behind her in the woods. She spun around, and that's when she saw it. Something tall darting from behind one tree to another. At first, she was so startled, she almost panicked. But after a moment, she figured it was probably just her imagination playing tricks. She focused on the spot where she had seen the movement, then turned back to the creek. That's when she heard it. A strange, high-pitched whistling sound, almost like a whoop. She turned around again and saw it clearly this time. A tall, slender creature hopping from one tree to the next, making that odd sound as it moved. It wasn't like anything she had ever seen before. She had seen pictures of Bigfoot, but this thing was something else entirely. It looked like a very tall, thin figure, almost boneless, not like the well-known Slender Man. It was like a 20-foot puppet wearing a long, dark dress, moving in a way that reminded her of those wavy car dealership signs, except there was no wind to make it move like that. She was completely freaked out. This creature ruined her entire experience. She bolted out of the woods as fast as she could, and she never saw anything like it again. She has one thing to say: if you ever find yourself in the Ohio wilderness, you'd better stay alert. I was alone in a place near a forest in the UK, and it was incredible. I remember noticing different colors at the start of each trail, each representing difficulty for bikers and length for walkers, although, to be honest, I'm still not sure what those colors meant. Anyway, I decided to take the blue trail first, curious to see where it led. I found it thrilling, so I decided to try the more difficult route. That's when things started to feel strange. As I walked, I had a bizarre sensation that the forest was swallowing me whole. Everything around me seemed to get larger, and I felt like I was further away from everything. I tried to ignore it, but I ended up losing track of time and found myself off course. Now, keep in mind, I'm usually very aware of my surroundings, so this was odd. I stumbled upon a strange clearing with two options. One direction seemed to lead toward the exit, and the other went deeper into the woods. True to my nature, I went deeper into the forest. I found a narrow trail that didn't look right. Something felt off, but I ignored my gut instinct and kept going. The trail soon became rough, and it was hard to even walk on it. I turned back, but for a few minutes, I just stood there, staring down the trail. It felt like something was watching me from all angles, even though it was practically impossible for that many eyes to be there. I started walking back up, too tired to ride my bike. Remember, my bike tires were completely fine, no flats, no issues. I wish I still had those pictures. When I reached the spot where I started, the sensation of time being warped hit again. It felt like the path had stretched by half a mile, as if the woods were shifting. I walked up the trail, that eerie feeling creeping back, stronger than before. This path is long, with a slightly steep hill on my left, and a narrow river to my right, about 4 feet deep and wide. The bushes on the other side were broken up by occasional trees. As I made my way up, I heard a woman crying from behind a tree up ahead. I slowed down, curious, but I kept wondering, why would someone be hiding behind a tree to cry? I edged closer to the river, hoping to check on her, especially since the area had a reputation for people committing suicide. But when I looked, no one was there, and the crying stopped. I was a little shaken, but I kept walking, now at a faster pace. I'd had strange experiences before, but never like this, never in the woods. Usually, it happened in buildings or houses. A minute or so later, as I kept walking, I suddenly felt a chill. The crying started again, but now it was across the river. I didn't look this time. Instead, I quickened my pace, and as I did, I heard rustling in the bushes, as if something was following me. The crying grew louder and more frantic. I could feel panic setting in. My bike, which had been fine moments ago, now had a flat tire out of nowhere. The pressure was building, and I decided I had to get out of there. With adrenaline coursing through me, I tried to hop on my bike, but the back tire had completely deflated. Now, my only choice was to sprint, carrying my bike with me and hoping I wouldn't trip. The crying was getting closer, and I was terrified. I ran faster and faster, feeling desperate. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I saw the car park in the distance. The crying stopped, fading back down the trail. I burst into the car park, out of breath and shaking. A few people stared at me, probably thinking I was insane. As I ran toward the exit, I noticed something unbelievable. My bike, which had been flat, was suddenly back to normal. The tire was firm again, as if nothing had happened. In shock, I hopped on and pedaled away from the woods as fast as I could, never looking back. I've never returned since. Every time I tell this story, people get hesitant about visiting with me. The scariest part of this experience is that I have Irish roots, and according to Irish folklore, there's a spirit known as the Banshee. She's often seen near rivers and lakes, washing blood-stained clothes. It's said that if you see her doing this, the person whose clothes they are will die. Alternatively, if you hear her cry, it foretells death, either yours or someone close to you. Since 2017, I've lost my aunt, two of my best friends, and a dog. Lee Woods is no joke. There are many stories about this place. Just search Lee Woods online and you'll find them. It's considered one of the most haunted places in the UK. And even the ghost of Isambard Kingdom Brunel has reportedly been seen there, watching over the suspension bridge he designed. I might share more stories later. I've had other strange experiences, but none quite like this one. Hey, Swamp Dweller. I'm a long-time listener, but this is the first time I've ever shared a story here. I used to live in Fairbanks, Alaska, and let me tell you, the landscape there is breathtaking. Sometimes just stepping outside felt like being part of a painting. Despite its beauty, Alaska hides plenty of dangers people might not realize, like moose charging at your car, having to drive between towns because of engine failure, and the fact that your lungs could freeze if the cold gets too extreme. Most of these risks can be avoided, especially thanks to the dedicated police force and rescue services. Still, it's important to recognize that the people in Alaska, well, they're built differently. Folks are tough, and they're always ready to help a stranger, since you never know when you might need help yourself. I was about 8 years old when we moved there. My stepdad was a trucker who spent weeks on the road, and my mom worked long nights as a respiratory therapist. I was a pretty lonely kid. There aren't many people in Alaska, and my class was small. I had just moved to town a year before and had trouble finding my place among the other kids. When my parents did manage to take time off, they'd take me camping to make up for the time lost. Because of that, I've seen a lot of Alaska's parks, and they're incredible. But one thing I'd advise, don't stay overnight on those trips. One time, we camped at Denali National Park, a huge place, over 7,000 square miles of wild land, with an additional 2,800 square miles of protected nature nearby. The park's northern part is filled with thick pine forests and streams, while Mount Denali towers in the south, a snow-capped giant standing 20,310 feet high. There's a ton of wildlife: bears, wolves, elk, moose, deer, raccoons, foxes, you name it, it's probably there. Stunning, aside from the mosquitoes. In Alaska, they joke that mosquitoes are the state bird. They might not be quite that big, but they're huge, about the size of a quarter. And since these mosquitoes have to break through the thick hides of bears and moose, they know how to feed gently. We were set to camp for 2 nights. My stepdad was determined to fish as much as he could, while my mom wanted to relax and watch the animals. I, on the other hand, was more into exploring, but given where we were and my fear of predators, I mostly stayed close by and fished with my dad. It went well that first day. The fish were biting every 10 minutes or so. I must have found a great spot, or maybe I was just lucky. I'd never caught so many fish before. We kept 2 for dinner that night, and my mom was in a good mood after watching a herd of elk drinking from the stream. We cooked the fish as the sun set, and I listened to my parents tell stories about their childhoods under the most stunning night sky I'd ever seen. After a while, I was exhausted and decided to crawl into my tent. I fell asleep quickly, but that's when things started to get strange. I woke up suddenly in total darkness. I was startled, but then I remembered where I was and chuckled to myself. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound from outside my tent near the flap. I froze, listening. It must have been a tree, I thought, but we didn't camp near any trees. My mom had made sure of that, fearing pine cones could damage the tent. Could have been explained away, probably, by a more rational person. But for an 8-year-old like me, if it wasn't a tree, I had no idea what it was. Could have been anything: a monster, a boogeyman. My body stiffened in fear, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. My muscles locked up, and I just listened, not moving a muscle. After what felt like a long time, everything stopped. The next sound I heard was a single footstep, as if something shifted right outside my tent. For a moment, I thought it might have been my parents checking on me. I still felt nervous, but I thought it was probably them. So I crawled toward the tent's opening, trying to be as quiet as possible. Some deep part of me knew something wasn't right, even if I kept trying to dismiss it. I reached for the zipper and felt the small metal eyelet touch my fingers. Just as I did, I heard something else, deep, guttural breathing from right outside. I froze again, but now I was in a strange, uncomfortable position. One arm was raised, holding myself up, and I realized how stiff and awkward I had become. The breathing turned into snuffling, then a snort. It was sniffing, coming closer, getting nearer to the thin, fragile fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I began to shake. Then I heard a laugh. It was deep, and for that brief moment, I thought it was my dad trying to scare me. I felt a wave of relief, then anger and hysteria all at once. I yanked the zipper down, pulled up the flap, screamed, and, well, I peed myself. What I saw standing there, just outside my tent, was absolutely not my dad. It was hunkered over my tent entrance, standing on two legs. It was covered in fur, though I couldn't tell the color in the dark. But its eyes were enormous. Amber, I think. The wolf-like head pulled back its lips, revealing massive fangs. Its pointed ears flattened against the back of its head, started growling, sending waves of terror through my body. I screamed louder. Then one long, hairy arm reached out toward the opening of the tent, a clawed hand inching closer. That's when a loud gunshot rang out, followed by a crack in the distance. The creature spun to its left so quickly it was almost a blur. I saw its back and a long, fluffy tail. Its foot came into view, and I saw that its anatomy resembled a wolf's. My dad yelled and fired another shot. The creature moved so fast, it was almost impossible to track. In the blink of an eye, it vanished into the woods. My dad rushed over to the tent, took one look inside to check if I was okay, then turned back to the forest, still holding his revolver. I'd never seen him so terrified. I was crying and asking over and over what that thing was, but I don't think we'll ever know. My parents said it was a bear, but I'm sure it was something else, something much worse. Hi, I'm an enthusiastic solo traveler, and I want to share one of my experiences from my travels across the US in 2022. Many have heard of my encounter with a bear in the Colorado area, which turned into a real fight for survival. But only a few know about the 2 nights I spent on a trail that pushed me to move to a different campsite. This is one of those nights. It happened in Arkansas, just across the Mississippi River from Mississippi. I'd heard about a possible campsite at the end of a dirt road, deep in a cypress swamp. I ventured further into the swamp, half expecting to encounter something eerie, like a shack or an abandoned structure. I eventually arrived as darkness fell, so I quickly set up camp, boiling water for my usual dinner. Probably beef stroganoff, as I had plenty of that meal, thanks to my friends Brandon and Raleigh. After finishing my meal, I began preparing for bed when I heard a noise from across the swamp. Something like a knock or perhaps a pinging sound. If you've ever been in a swamp at night, you know it's filled with the sounds of frogs, crickets, otters splashing, and various animals. So a knock definitely stood out. It wasn't scary at first, but it caught my attention. Moments later, I heard a second knock, but this time from a completely different spot. Then, after a couple of minutes, the same pattern repeated. One knock to my left, followed by another to my right. The sounds came from the murky swamp beside me, forming a strange pattern. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the water, careful as always. With a flashlight in the swamp at night, you're often greeted by the glow of tiny reflective lights, the eyes of the swamp's creatures. Things were getting a little creepy, but not enough for me to pack up and leave. I went back to my truck, and that's when I heard the knock again. Along with the knock, there was what could only be described as mumbling. Each time, there was a knock, followed by a mumbling sound from a different location. As the sounds continued, I noticed that they seemed to move around. During this, my mind started wandering back to stories I'd heard in high school, especially the ones about the Icena Dam. One of my favorite books was Swamp Thing, and now I cursed myself for even thinking about it. Isolation, darkness, strange sounds, they can really mess with your mind. The noises continued, steady, without getting louder, but now there was the occasional flicker of light mixed in. Could have been fireflies or maybe a lighter flicking. The sounds themselves were real, though. I've had close encounters with Bigfoot before, and this felt similar, like they were curious about me. But my more rational side started thinking that maybe it was just some swamp dwellers who wanted me gone. Ultimately, I decided it was time to leave and find a new spot up the road. Luckily, my truck setup was simple and easy to move. Within minutes, I had packed everything, hopped into the cab, and drove off. Once I was away from the swamp, I felt myself calm down and eventually found another campsite. But it was a restless night of no sleep. Nothing from the swamp came after me, but there was definitely an odd vibe in the air. I'm sure something was out there. I just don't know what. Even though I'm not easily scared, I know that when you solo camp, you need to have tough skin and a solid mind. But that night, the atmosphere was so thick it felt like you could slice it with a knife, and I wasn't about to take any chances. That's the story. I've been asked many times if I'm afraid of camping alone, and my answer is always no. I'm not scared of animals. I respect them and keep my distance, but I use common sense. So far, so good. My name's Luke, and I'm 20 years old now. This story is about something that happened when I was 17. Even today, it still sends chills down my spine. In May of 2017, I spent more and more time on my mountain bike. I was getting tired of riding around the streets and wanted to try a trail ride through the woods. I had never been to Lee Woods before, but after some research, I thought it looked like a good place to try. It was only a few miles from home, so it would be a nice ride. When I arrived, the place seemed peaceful, almost surreal for a woodland area in England. I'm 29 and live in Iowa. If you've been here, you know that this state is mostly flat and doesn't have many great spots for hiking or camping, at least not with scenic views. This year, I decided to go camping for the first time in a quiet forest. I thought it would be the perfect starting point for camping since the land was flat, and the trail was easy to follow. The trail led to a small pond, so at least I'd have a bit of a view. The hike was short, just under an hour, but the pond at the end was pretty disappointing. It was tiny and surrounded by swampy ground, so I had to set up my tent farther into the forest where the ground was dry. To be honest, after a couple of hours, I got pretty bored. I decided to take a walk around the pond to see if there was anything else to explore. I wandered to the other side, but it was pretty much the same all around. It was a peaceful and pretty forest, but there wasn't much to set it apart. I headed back to my camp, and by then the sun was almost gone. I had brought a small fire starter, so I used it to light a fire and cook some food. But not long after sunset, I noticed a light across the pond. It was in the trees just beyond the water, but it was exactly where I had walked earlier, and I knew there was nothing there an hour ago. Even though I felt uneasy about the thought of someone else being out there with me, I knew this was one of the few camping trails in the area, so the chances of another camper being nearby weren't that high. I went about my night, glancing over at the light every so often. As it got darker, I realized the light I had thought was a campfire was actually a flashlight or some kind of artificial light. I couldn't figure out what it meant, but about an hour later, I noticed the light dimming, and after a few flickers, it turned off completely. I stared into the darkness for about 10 minutes, waiting for the light to come back on, but it never did. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine, but again, I wasn't sure what to make of it. The rest of the night was unexpectedly quiet. I slept, and as far as I know, nothing else happened. When the sun came up, I was still thinking about that light. I wanted answers, so I went around the other side of the pond where I had seen it. It didn't take long before I found the source, a large flashlight lying in the grass. The batteries were dead, but the flashlight looked almost new. No scratches or signs of wear. I looked around some more, but didn't find anything else that suggested someone had been there. After thinking it over, I decided to leave the flashlight where I found it and was heading back to my camp when I froze in my tracks. Across the pond, I saw someone standing near my fire pit in the middle of my camp. Then, I saw another person walk out of the trees and join them. They looked like two grown men, but that was all I could tell from where I was. I was too terrified to shout or say anything, so I just watched as they moved around my camp and started looking through my things. One of them stopped and turned to face the pond. He stood there, scanning the trees where I was hiding until our eyes met for a brief second. I only saw him look at me for a moment, but it sent a chill down my spine. I watched him leave the camp and move into the trees. I lost sight of him for a second, but then I caught a glimpse of him running through the forest. I ran deeper into the woods, away from the pond. I knew the chances of them finding me were slim, but I was too scared to think clearly. I ran for about 15 minutes before I stopped and turned toward where my car was parked. Thankfully, I made it back safely, but I lost everything I had there. To sum it up, nothing else happened after that. I filed a police report, but it went nowhere. I still think about that flashlight, though. Was it theirs? Or did it belong to someone else? I keep telling myself it was part of a robbery and they didn't have any other plans, but deep down, I feel like I might have narrowly escaped something much worse in that forest. Back in high school, my house had a big backyard that led into a vast forest. When we were younger, my friends and I would venture far into the woods to play games. There was always a hint of danger in the air, which made everything more exciting. As we grew older, though, we stopped going out there since it seemed pointless. But one day, while I was hanging out with my friend Evan, he suggested the idea of going into the woods at night. Within minutes, our plan evolved from just a casual stroll into an overnight camping trip. Evan mentioned that his parents had a tent we could borrow, so we walked down the street and grabbed it from his garage. Neither of us had ever camped before, so we really didn't know what we were doing. Honestly, I don't think either of us thought much of it at the time, considering we'd only be out there for one night. After packing a bag with snacks, water, and a portable charger, we made our way into the woods. Quickly became clear that the flashlight Evan had was pretty terrible. It barely lit up anything beyond a few feet, which was enough to keep us from walking into trees or bushes, but we couldn't see much else. For the first 15 minutes, we talked excitedly about how creepy and fun it would be. But after another 15 minutes of walking, the conversation dropped off. The eerie silence in the woods had us both a little spooked. A few times I thought I heard something moving nearby, but the flashlight never reached far enough to confirm it. After 30 minutes of walking, we found a spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees. Evan wedged the flashlight on a bush to light up the area while we tried to set up the tent. He told me it was easy to assemble, but it was anything but. We probably spent an hour getting the tent to stay up without collapsing. To make things worse, every time we heard something, we'd have to grab the flashlight and shine it around before setting it back and starting over. At that point, I was starting to regret this whole idea. When we finally got the tent set up, things felt a bit less stressful. We sat inside, listening to the sounds of the woods. Sometimes it was dead silent, then birds or other animals would break the quiet. It was an interesting experience until we heard something that sounded all too familiar. We stayed in the tent, listening as footsteps moved around us. They didn't seem to be getting closer, more like they were just passing by. We both agreed that they sounded like human footsteps, nothing like the usual animals we'd hear. After a minute, the footsteps faded away, and Evan and I sat still, staring at the inside of the tent, trying to listen for any signs of movement. About 10 minutes later, once we were sure the person had moved on, we left the tent and sat outside. We both felt too exposed inside the tent, unable to see what was going on around us. As we sat and talked, the same footsteps began again, this time much closer. They kept getting nearer until it sounded like someone was walking right toward us. Evan shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but it continued. The footsteps came closer, and just when we thought we'd see who was out there, they stopped. We could hear them breathing just outside the light. Both of us froze, staring into the dark beyond the flashlight. Then we heard them take a step back before walking away. A minute later, the footsteps had disappeared, and the woods were completely silent again. We packed up the tent as fast as we could and left. We were so shaken that we didn't even go the right way home and ended up on a different street. We ended up at my place and stayed up all night in my room, talking about what had happened or what might have happened. We never went back into those woods, and to this day, I stay far away from any secluded places. Whoever was out there that night had to be up to something terrible, and I think we were dangerously close to finding out. Last year was the first time anything unusual happened during one of my camping trips. I've been camping alone for years, usually returning to the same spots, though I sometimes look for new places. For this particular trip, I chose a hiking trail called 4 Mile, a place I'd never been to before. I drove about 2 hours to a remote area to start the hike. Right from the beginning, I didn't enjoy the trail as much as I had expected, mainly because some parts were muddy and wet. Despite that, I kept going and tried to avoid those spots. After about 45 minutes of hiking, I noticed something off to the side of the trail. It was an old tent, worn out with a few rips in it. From a distance, I could tell no one was inside, so I walked closer. There were no signs of damage like someone had purposely wrecked it. It just seemed to have weathered over time. The fact that it was still standing at all was surprising to me. I looked around and inside it but found nothing. No gear, no personal items, just the tent itself. I stood there for a few minutes, confused, before returning to the trail. I thought about it for a while, but couldn't come up with any good reason someone would just leave a tent behind. For the next hour and a half, I kept finding abandoned items along the trail. Camping gear, hiking equipment, things that seemed to belong to one person. It gave me an eerie feeling. Who leaves all of this behind? It didn't seem like an accident. When I finally made it to the end of the trail, I set up camp far from the main path, wanting to be cautious. It was getting dark, so I stayed at my site until I was ready to sleep. I felt uneasy but eventually fell asleep without any problems. The next morning, I woke up early, around 4 or 5, before the sun came up. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, and immediately sensed something was wrong. Turning around, I saw a man standing just a few feet away from me on the other side of my tent. He was tall and thin, dressed in filthy clothes, with his face covered in dirt. He stared at me blankly. Frozen in fear, I couldn't move or speak at first. It almost didn't feel real. He spoke to me in a soft but unsettling voice. I nodded, trying to gather my things quickly, but he rushed toward me. I stumbled backward, repeating, "Okay," over and over in panic. The man stood over me, still with that vacant expression, and said again, "Leave." This time, I understood and quickly got up and ran, leaving everything behind. As I fled, I glanced back to see him rummaging through my backpack like a wild animal. I jogged as far as I could and then quickly walked the rest of the way back to my car. Thankfully, I kept my phone and keys on me, or things could have been much worse. Once I had service, I called the authorities. I learned there had been another similar case, though the person who reported it had chosen to keep it out of the public eye. It was likely the same person whose belongings I had found on the trail. After a week of speaking with the police, they were able to organize a small search party to check the trail. They found no sign of the man, but they did recover most of my belongings, scattered around my campsite like garbage. After that, the case went cold, just like the one before mine. The thing that always stays with me is how the man didn't keep anything. He didn't want any of the stuff. He just threw it all around the forest with no intention of using any of it. About a week or two ago, I went on a hike along a trail through the dense woods behind my town. It was a small, close-knit place with fewer than 1,000 people, so we were quite isolated from bigger cities. The forest on the outskirts was flat, with no mountains or hills, but there were some ponds and small streams running through the area. I was headed toward one of these streams, which I'd visited before but never had the chance to camp by until that day. I remembered from my previous visits that it was about a 3-hour walk, heading almost straight north. As I walked through the trees, it was very quiet, apart from the birds and the sounds of animals rustling through the leaves. There were no other hikers around, and I didn't expect to see anyone since there was no actual trail, just open woods. But about 45 minutes from the stream, I ran into someone. We were both walking toward each other, and neither of us seemed to notice the other until we were almost right next to each other, separated only by a couple of trees. I must have looked confused and a bit nervous, finding it odd to come across someone so far off the trail, but the man had the same look on his face. I was about to say something, but just before I could, his expression shifted into a slight, nervous smile, and he moved to the side and started walking away. I did the same, continuing on my way, but when I looked back after walking a bit further, I saw that the man had stopped walking and was nearly running off without saying a word. That encounter left me with a strange feeling, but seeing him run away only made it feel even weirder. It seemed like he was trying to avoid being seen, or maybe he didn't care about the rare chance we'd run into each other in the middle of nowhere. Either way, I tried not to think too much about it and continued to the stream. There wasn't an official campsite, so I just set my bag and tent down on the flattest spot I could find. As the sun was about to set, I got a fire going, throwing in some twigs and branches I found nearby, making sure it would burn for a few hours. I planned to stay up a while to stargaze. Out here, away from the lights of town, the Milky Way is a sight I never want to miss. Hours passed as I sat by the fire, waiting for the stars. Then, I heard something. Slow, careful footsteps coming from behind me. I turned and looked, but couldn't see much in the darkness. The footsteps stopped, though, which told me someone might be out there watching me. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the trees. The beam reached quite far, but when I moved it back and forth, I didn't see anyone. My heart rate picked up as the unsettling feeling returned. "Anyone out there?" I called, but there was no response. I waited a moment, then tried again. "Hello?" Still no sound, no footsteps. After a few moments of hesitation, I decided to walk toward where I thought the noise had come from. Maybe I'd been mistaken, but I needed to check. I carefully stepped through the woods, shining my flashlight ahead, until I reached the spot where I'd heard the footsteps. I turned the light to my left, searching behind trees, and suddenly I saw him. A large man, standing motionless, about 20 feet away. It was the same man I'd run into earlier that day. Even though I was shining the light directly on him, he didn't move. I quickly tried to stay calm, keeping my flashlight moving as though I hadn't noticed him, hoping he wouldn't realize I had seen him. I then began walking back to my tent, trying to act as casual as possible. Once I reached my gear, I looked around once more before quickly leaving the campsite behind. I made my way toward the river, keeping a safe distance, and when I felt far enough, I broke into a run, not stopping until I was sure I was out of his sight. I found a spot to rest and stayed awake until sunrise, unsure if he had followed me, but I never heard or saw him again. I have no idea why he was out there or why he had been hiding near my campsite, but I never returned to collect my tent. The thought of finding him there again was too unsettling. This isn't a tale about rock climbing, but rather a personal experience I feel compelled to share. I told this story in a video years ago, but I want to recount it here for those who may not have seen it before. I spent my childhood in rural areas, moving between farms in Tennessee and isolated parts of Florida. Growing up in such places meant we didn't have access to a lot of things that others might take for granted. We had no internet, no TV, and of course, no cell phones. I know it sounds like a nightmare for today's generation, but we were the last generation before the internet really took off. Dial-up was available, but it was something most of us didn't use at the time. Despite it all, life wasn't so bad, except for those long summer days when we worked in the fields, picking beans under the scorching sun. We lived in an old Civil War-era cabin in Tennessee, far away from the nearest neighbor. I have plenty of exciting stories from those days, and this is just one of them. It all started on a typical Friday night when my brothers and I were home alone. With nothing to do, we decided to play a game of search around the house, which was like hide and seek. It was pitch black outside, so we mostly stayed inside. For context, our cabin was on a steep hill with a long, winding driveway. The house had 3 levels: the basement, the main floor, and the upstairs, which was just my room. We also had a back deck about 10 to 12 feet above the ground. At night, it was so dark outside that we didn't venture much past the front porch. As fun as the game was, it started to feel a bit repetitive. I had the idea of going outside to hide on the roof, hoping it would add some excitement. I quickly regretted that decision. First, everything felt fine. The weather was chilly, typical for late fall, and there was a light breeze that made the air feel fresh and peaceful. But after sitting on the roof for a few minutes, something started to feel strange. I had been distracted by the soothing sound of crickets and cicadas, but suddenly, all the noise stopped. This struck me as odd, but as a teenager, I didn't yet realize that silence like that often signals something bad is about to happen. I sat there as still as I could, trying to listen, but all I could hear was the faint breeze rustling the leaves. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud noise from the other side of the roof. It was so sudden, it felt as if something had landed on the roof. I looked over, but there was nothing in sight. I felt uneasy, and my first instinct was to get off the roof and run. But before I panicked too much, I remembered my brothers were probably just messing with me since they had likely given up searching for me inside. I opened the window and called them up. They came running, grumbling about how the roof was off limits. When my older brother reached me, I asked if he had been making noises on the roof. He denied it, but suggested we investigate. So we slowly made our way to the center of the roof and listened for a moment. Everything was quiet again, just like before. I was on edge, ready to defend myself if need be, when we heard a pounding noise from the far side of the roof. It sounded like hooves running on metal, but there was no sign of anything. The roof was completely empty, except for us. Yet we could clearly hear the sound of footsteps, getting closer and running in circles around us. I stretched my arms out, trying to feel anything, but I couldn't. The strangest part was that I could feel the vibrations of something running, but there was nothing there to see. The footsteps continued to circle us for what felt like forever, though it was likely no more than a minute. Then, suddenly, the noise rushed off toward the other side of the roof and seemed to leap off, vanishing into thin air. We immediately ran back inside, locked the windows and doors, and huddled together, completely freaked out. To this day, I still have no idea what happened that night, but I know there are things in this world that we can't explain. That experience, along with many others, has only reinforced that belief. 2 years ago, I was living with my younger brother on the East Coast. We didn't really go out much, mostly hanging out with friends, grabbing food, but never really doing anything adventurous. Eventually, I decided to look up activities, and one of the most common suggestions was camping, especially since we were near the Appalachian Mountains. I mentioned it to my brother, but he wasn't interested. A few days later, I bought a few things, like a small tent and safety tools, packed up one of my old backpacks, and drove out to a nearby trail. I wasn't very experienced, and going alone wasn't the smartest idea, but I figured it would only be for one night, so even if something went wrong, it wouldn't be that bad. After an hour of driving, I arrived at the trail. There were no cars parked, and I didn't see anyone around. I got out, threw on my backpack, and walked to the trailhead. The path was narrow and poorly made, but it was good enough. I didn't think it was a well-traveled trail. I had just picked it out from a list, choosing one that wasn't too long. As I hiked, it became clear how little used the trail was. The bushes were overgrown, blocking parts of the way, and in some spots, the grass had grown so thick it was hard to tell where the trail ended and the wilderness began. But after an hour, I reached the end, and what I saw looked about like I expected for the camping site. It was small, mostly overgrown, but there was something that caught my attention right away: a pile of logs at the far side of the camp. I walked over and saw charred wood flakes blowing in the wind. It must have been used recently, maybe even the night before. I looked around but didn't see any tents or signs of anyone else being there. Unsure, I went to the other side of the camping area, dropped my stuff, and began setting up the tent. It wasn't too late, so I took my time, making sure the tent was set up well. Once I was finished, I took a break, sitting and relaxing for a while. There was still about an hour of sunlight, so I spent it eating and sitting on my sleeping bag inside the tent. Before long, the sun started to set, and just after that, I heard a noise nearby, a crackling sound, like from a campfire. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, only to find a man sitting across the camp, right next to the pile of half-burnt logs. He looked older than me, probably in his 40s, but I couldn't see much else because of the fading light. He was already looking at me, so I nervously waved. After a few seconds, he waved back. I walked around to the back of my tent, grabbed some sticks, and started my own small fire. Within minutes, it was mostly dark, with only the light from my campfire and the man's campfire illuminating the area. I kept glancing over, trying to see if he had a tent or backpack, but all I could see was him. The more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Where had he even come from? My tent was set up right by the trail, so I would have heard him coming unless he came from the other side, which was just empty woods. I sat outside for at least an hour, probably 2, and never saw him move. He just sat by the fire, staring ahead. Eventually, I decided to go inside, thinking I was probably overreacting and that he was just another camper. It was a public campsite, after all. I laid down, trying to rest, but for some reason, I couldn't sleep, so I just stared at the tent ceiling and listened to the faint crackling of his fire. An hour later, I heard leaves crunching, moving toward my tent. I sat up and listened closely, and then I saw the shadow of the man standing on the other side of the fabric. My whole body froze as I watched him stand there, motionless, silent. After a moment, his shadow started to move away, and I heard the leaves crunch as he walked off into the distance. I quickly unzipped the tent and looked outside. The campsite was empty. The man was gone, leaving only the smoldering logs behind. I started packing up, shoving the tent into its bag and even breaking a few of the rods to hurry up. I left without ever seeing the man return. What happened out there or what would have happened next, I'll never know. I had taken my camper out to a remote forest a few miles from my home. I live in a rural area surrounded by forests, so camping is pretty common around here. The spot I drove to wasn't very popular though. just a small area that could fit a few campers. I liked it because it was rarely busy, and the road to get there was wide enough for my camper to pass through easily. When I arrived, the field where I parked was empty. I had no particular plans, so I stayed inside for a while before stepping out to set up my canopy. Then, I got my chair ready and started collecting firewood. It was still well before dusk, but I wanted to get everything prepared before it got too dark. I went into the woods behind the camper, far enough that I couldn't see the campsite anymore. A lot of the wood was still damp from rain we had a couple of nights ago, so it took me some time to find dry pieces. After about 20 minutes, I returned to the camper and noticed a man setting up a tent nearby. He nodded at me when he saw me come back, and I nodded back, acknowledging him. He didn't seem unusual, and I didn't think much of it except for being a bit disappointed that I wouldn't have the place to myself anymore. After I threw the sticks down, I went back into the camper to have some privacy, grabbed a beer, and sat inside with the sunroof open. I'm not sure how long I was inside, maybe 30 minutes or so, before I stood up and looked out the window. The man had finished setting up his tent, but now that it was all put together, I saw how tattered it was. The tent had holes and tiers, with flaps hanging off and blowing in the wind. It looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. It was in such bad shape, it probably wouldn't have been any better than just sleeping outside. I didn't see the man inside, though. I looked around the camp, but he wasn't anywhere. I left the camper to start the campfire while still wondering why he had such a worn-out tent. The sun was setting as I got the fire going and sat next to it, still not sure where the man had gone. I stayed there for a while, the darkness creeping in and leaving only the faint glow of the campfire lighting the small area around me. As the night went on, I began to get more curious about where he had gone and why he hadn't returned to his tent. I checked my watch. It was nearly 1 a.m., meaning it had been dark for almost 4 hours. I got up and walked closer to the man's tent, calling out, "Are you in there?" There was no answer. I stood in the middle of the campsite, looking around the dark forest, wondering if the man had gotten lost out there. As I scanned the surroundings, I started to feel uneasy. Then, a sudden movement by one of the trees made me stop. I stared in that direction, still unsure of what I'd seen until I started to make out the figure of a man standing near a tree, perfectly still as if trying to hide. A wave of fear washed over me, and the more I looked at him, the less sure I was that he was the same man from the tent. I took a few cautious steps back before quickly heading to my camper. I peered out the window and saw the man still standing in the same spot, staring in my direction. After hesitating for a moment, I rushed to the front of the camper and started the engine, driving away from the site. What really terrifies me is that if that wasn't the man from the tent, then it could have been someone else standing out in the woods. Maybe he did something to the man from the tent, or maybe they were together, and the man from the tent was hiding somewhere in the forest, watching me without me knowing. I'm a 27-year-old man, and this event took place last year. I decided to take a solo vacation, and one of my friends had a cabin near where I was planning to go. It all worked out perfectly, saving me quite a bit of money, which I really appreciated. I had never been to the cabin before, but I had heard my friend talk about it a lot and had seen pictures. It seemed like the most peaceful, relaxing spot, exactly what I needed for my getaway. The cabin was in a very remote location, around 40 minutes from the nearest town, which felt quite far. A big part of that distance was due to the rough dirt road leading up to it, which required slow driving. When I arrived, I must have stood outside for nearly an hour, just gazing at the landscape and soaking in the stillness. Afterward, I made a simple dinner and spent some time on my phone before deciding to take a short walk to make use of the remaining daylight. There were several small trails near the cabin that I had noticed while standing outside. I texted my friend to confirm that they were actual trails and that I wouldn't get lost, and he reassured me that everything was fine. He mentioned that the closest trail behind the cabin was a straight path through the woods. That sounded perfect to me, so I put on my walking boots and set off. The trail wasn't the smoothest, but it wasn't bad either. It was definitely a trail I couldn't get lost on, which was my biggest concern. I walked for about 30 minutes, enjoying the nature around me, letting my thoughts wander, until I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. As soon as I halted, it went silent. Then, a moment later, I heard it again. A man's voice, loud and angry. It sounded far off, and I tried to spot where it was coming from. The voice came again, somewhere to the right of the trail, but I still couldn't see anyone. It sounded like he was shouting at someone, though. I didn't want to leave the trail, but something felt off about the situation. I wasn't sure if there were any other cabins or houses nearby, so I couldn't be certain whether it was unusual for someone to be around this trail. However, hearing the voice off the trail made it seem odd. I listened for a few more minutes, hearing the man shout angrily in a language I didn't understand, and strangely, nobody answered, at least not loudly enough for me to hear. Eventually, I decided to move a bit closer, not to reveal myself, but just to check what was going on. I made sure to stay on the trail as I ventured further into the woods, but once I got closer, the yelling suddenly stopped. The silence made me feel uneasy, and I quickly turned back, jogging to the trail. My gut told me something wasn't right, and being out in the woods was definitely not where I wanted to feel like I was in danger. The sun was starting to set, so I figured it was time to head back to the cabin. I hurried along the trail, and just a couple of minutes later, I heard the crunch of leaves coming from the woods. I turned my head quickly, but the shadows from the trees made it hard to see clearly. The sound seemed like someone was running behind me from somewhere in the woods, not far away. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I turned and ran the rest of the way to the cabin, locking everything up as soon as I got inside. I glanced out the back window and saw a man walking toward the cabin. He was wearing a thick hoodie and holding something in his hand. In a panic, I grabbed my keys and ran for my car parked at the front of the cabin. I jumped in and sped off, not seeing anyone follow me. After I talked with my friend, he made it clear that nobody should have been out there. Who the man was or who he had been yelling at remains a mystery, but if I had stayed in that cabin, I might never have been seen again. A few years ago, I took a camping trip on my own. It was my first year working after college, and life was rough then. I wasn't earning much, and my rent was high, so I was under a lot of pressure most of the time. I hoped a weekend away would help me unwind. I picked a trail that was one of the more secluded ones in my state. I'd already done most of the easier hikes around there with friends. Some were short enough to finish in a day, but this time I planned to stay for 2 nights. Although I'd hiked alone before, this was going to be my longest solo trip. I had my gear packed in the car before heading to work on Friday, planning to leave as soon as my shift ended. After work, I got on the highway out of the city. While the lanes heading into town were packed with traffic, I had a clear path in front of me. I grabbed a quick meal at a fast food place on the way and arrived at the trailhead around dusk. There wasn't a place to pitch my tent for the night, so I had to sleep in the car. I stretched out in the back seat, but it was cramped since I'm 6 feet 4 inches. I didn't sleep well, but woke up early, had a quick breakfast from my packed food, locked the car, and started on the trail by 7:30. There were a handful of other cars at the trailhead as I expected, but I hadn't seen any people, so I figured everyone else had already started. About halfway through the day, the trail led me into a quiet valley. I hadn't seen a soul until 2 men came from the opposite direction. We crossed paths on a narrow part of the trail lined with trees. I stepped aside to let them pass, and they stopped to chat, asking where I was headed and how long I'd been out there. Small talk you might expect. One looked like an older, big guy with a long beard and a baseball cap, while the other was younger, maybe around my age, and I was 24. They both wore jeans and t-shirts, not the typical hiking clothes, but they had big backpacks, so that seemed normal. After a few minutes, I said I'd better get moving, but I felt uneasy as I walked away. At the time, I thought I was just being paranoid, but there's something unsettling about running into strangers out in the middle of nowhere. I knew they had the upper hand if anything happened. I kept hiking and was relieved to be alone again. I checked over my shoulder a few times to make sure I wasn't being followed, but the winding trail didn't give me much peace of mind. As it started getting dark, I found a designated camping spot to set up for the night. The trail required campers to use specific sites to keep the area clean, so mine was the only spot within a mile. By the time I pitched my tent, the sun was nearly gone. I noticed how silent everything was as I sat down to relax. My headlamp cast a glow near the fire ring, where an old log and some paper scraps were left by previous campers. It was chilly, so I started a small fire and had a quick snack instead of a full meal. After an hour, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. As the night went on, the sounds of the forest seemed to get louder. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep. After a couple of hours, just as I was starting to relax, I heard a faint sound, a soft whisper, barely louder than the wind in the trees. My pulse sped up as I strained to listen. There were definitely multiple voices. I stayed as still as possible, trying to make out what was being said. Peeking through the mesh window of my tent, I saw the glow of a cigarette about 30 feet away. It was too dark to see much else, but there was definitely someone there. I checked my phone. It was past 1 a.m., far too late for anyone to be hiking around, and there were no other campsites nearby. I knew something was wrong. Deciding it was safer to hide, I unzipped the opposite side of my tent quietly and slipped out. I was wearing clothes because of the cold, but I didn't have shoes. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way to the tree line, guided by the moonlight. I had my phone with me, but of course there was no signal. I lay down among the bushes, keeping my eyes on the cigarette's faint ember. They stayed put for about 10 minutes, and I started thinking I'd overreacted. But then I watched as two figures approached my campsite, still murmuring to each other, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. The cigarette glowed brighter as they got closer, and one of them called out softly, "Hey, anyone there?" I didn't respond. They waited a moment, then one of them said, louder, "He must be asleep." My heart was racing as I watched them unzip the other side of my tent and look inside. One of them shined a light into the tent, then stepped back, looking around and talking quietly. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying, but I heard one ask, "Where is he?" And the other reply, "I don't know." Eventually, they moved away from my tent, occasionally glancing back, looking confused. After what felt like forever, one of them put out his cigarette, and they disappeared into the darkness. I stayed hidden, not daring to move. It was cold, but not unbearable, probably around 50 degrees. When dawn finally came, I felt a bit safer. I crept back to my tent, and both sides were open, one from my escape, the other from the two men. Aside from that, nothing seemed disturbed. The fire was long dead, but I rekindled it for a hot breakfast. After eating, I packed everything quickly and broke down my tent. I half expected to see those two guys waiting somewhere, but thankfully, they didn't show up. I set out on the trail, moving quickly. I guessed my nighttime visitors were the men I'd seen earlier, though I couldn't be certain. Their shapes in the moonlight just seemed familiar. I passed other hikers on my way out, and each time, I worried it might be them. Just my luck, about an hour from my camp, I saw the same two men. They were at a campsite off the trail with a fire going, and one of them was smoking a cigarette. As I passed, the older one looked at me and called out, "There he is!" A chill ran down my spine. It felt like he was mocking me. I kept my gaze forward and walked without reacting. Soon, I was back at my car. Once inside, I locked the doors, finally letting myself breathe fully. I started the engine and drove away, knowing I'd think twice before camping alone again. The whole experience shook me up. Whatever they had in mind, it couldn't have been good. My name is Emma, and this happened when I was 19. At the time, I still lived with my parents, along with my older sister Sarah. I had decided not to attend college that year and was just trying to figure out what to do. Sarah was studying medicine at the local college, but she was away when this story took place. She and one of her friends, Mia, were planning a camping trip and asked me to come along, probably out of pity since I was always at home. I agreed, not because I loved camping, but because I was getting bored being at home. I didn't know Mia that well, as Sarah hadn't known her for very long. I tagged along but felt like a third wheel from the beginning. We made the 4-hour drive on a Saturday morning and arrived at our campsite around noon. The place was crowded, filled with families and children running around. There were also some other young people like us. It was the type of place where you book a spot in advance and stay there. Apart from the crowds, there was a beach nearby and a large forest with many hiking trails. On the first evening, we noticed a group of guys next to us. They seemed older, probably in their mid-20s. After we got the fire going, they came over to our site. We stood around chatting for a while, and they introduced themselves as Luke and Alex. They were friendly, but it was clear they were more interested in Sarah and Mia. On the second day, the two of them went to check out the beach. I had already been there and didn't feel like going back, so I stayed behind at the campsite alone. Luke and Alex returned while Sarah and Mia were still away. They came up to me while I was sitting near the smoldering fire pit, poking at the remains of the fire. I looked up as they approached, and Alex asked where the others were. I could tell he was looking for them. I told him they would be back soon, and then Alex looked at Luke and then back at me. He told me they had found a spot on one of the trails with a great view of the lake and invited me to join them. Feeling curious and slightly adventurous, I agreed to go. We walked down the trail talking about random things, but after half an hour, we were deep in the woods. The forest was getting thicker, and we were far from the families and kids near the campsite. What concerned me was that the trail seemed to be going downhill, which didn't make sense if there was supposed to be a great view. The further we walked, the narrower the path became, overgrown with trees. There were a few times I thought we were lost, but Luke and Alex kept going and I followed. It was then that I realized how vulnerable I was out there with two strangers. I didn't know them at all. Eventually, we reached a clearing, and there was a tent set up. Luke and Alex stopped ahead of me, standing in front of the tent. I walked up next to them and looked at Luke, confused. "Is this it?" I asked. Neither of them said anything. I walked over to the tent and peeked inside. There was a sleeping bag rolled out with some items scattered around, including a bottle of alcohol and a roll of duct tape. I turned to Luke and Alex. "Why do you have a tent set up here?" I asked. Luke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We like to come out here sometimes. It's a quiet spot to relax away from the main campsite," he said. I really wanted to leave, but I didn't want to act like I knew what they were up to. I was at their mercy anyway. "I think I should head back," I said. "Sarah will be looking for me." Before I could turn around, Luke grabbed my arm. "No need to rush, stay a while," he said. Then he squeezed my arm tighter. I yanked my arm free and slapped him in the face. The time for being nice was over, but I regretted the slap immediately. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because of the anger I saw in his eyes. Alex stepped in to block my path, but I was quicker. I pushed past him and ran down the trail, which was hard to see. I could hear them coming behind me, but I didn't stop. My only goal was to get back before they caught up. The trail seemed longer on the way back, but I kept moving. I stumbled a few times and nearly lost the path. After what felt like forever, I made it back to the main area where the campsites and people were. I finally allowed myself to catch my breath and leaned over to rest. There was a family camping next to me. Just then, Luke and Alex caught up to me. I screamed when I saw them, which drew the attention of an older man at the campsite next to mine. He looked at me with concern. We made eye contact and I started to cry. He and a woman came over to me, and at that moment, Luke and Alex ran off. When the man reached me, I told him everything that had happened in the woods. Within an hour, park rangers and the police were involved. As I later found out, Luke and Alex had already disappeared before anyone could question them. They would have surely denied everything, but I could have led the police back to that spot in the woods where they had set up camp. It would have been bad for them. They were probably planning something awful, but I think they were really after Sarah. When they found me alone, they decided I was good enough. I'm thankful it was me and not Sarah, because I have no idea if she would have been able to escape. I'm from the northern part of New Zealand, and this happened during one of our summers around 8 years ago. I was traveling around the country with a few friends after finishing school, and we spent several months backpacking before starting college. For those who aren't familiar, while the North Island has some cool places, the mountains in the south are something else. I was really excited about doing some of the mountain trails, some of which took a few days to complete, while others could be done in just a day. I'd researched the hikes online and picked out a few that looked great. I was traveling with two friends. Travis, who was a year older and had more experience traveling, he'd backpacked in Europe the year before, and Jacob, who was my age and, like me, not very experienced in hiking. At the time, we were staying in a hostel in Queenstown on the South Island. Queenstown is a popular tourist destination with several famous attractions, including bungee jumping spots. We all did the biggest jump together, and there were plenty of good day hikes we could do without staying overnight. One morning, we planned to head out early to try a more challenging trail. We'd done our research and packed our food and gear, but the night before, my two friends had partied a little too much. We were out at a bar until pretty late, and I headed back to the hostel around midnight. Travis and Jacob stayed out longer, but I figured they'd come back soon. I was wrong. The next morning, I couldn't get them up. Even if I did, they'd probably be too slow to make it on the trail. We could have done it another day, but I was eager to go and didn't mind being alone. At 8 a.m., I left the hostel, and by 9 a.m., I was on the trail. Felt good not to sit out, and I could always hike with them another time. The hike was beautiful, and after a few hours, I was feeling great. There were a few people around, but I kept to myself. I had started off in a dense forest, climbing a steep slope when I noticed two guys ahead of me. They were a little slower, but not enough to warrant me passing them. I kept about a 10-meter distance behind. When we reached a plateau, I got close enough for them to step aside and let me go ahead. They seemed a bit older, probably between 25 and 30. One of them nodded at me, and I did the same in return. After that, I didn't see them for the next few hours. Around noon, I reached a mountain peak on the trail. Instead of retracing my steps, I decided to take a less popular route down. There weren't many people on this path. In fact, I felt like I was the only one for miles. By 2 p.m., I was hungry, so I stopped to eat. While sitting, I glanced around and saw two figures on the trail in the distance. They were too far for me to see clearly or tell which direction they were moving, but I assumed they were coming towards me since I hadn't seen them go the other way. I finished eating quickly and resumed walking. As I walked, I kept an eye on them, and little by little, I noticed they were getting closer. Soon, they were right behind me. That's when I realized it was the two guys I had seen earlier. I moved aside to let them pass, just like they had for me. But instead of walking past, they stopped next to me. One guy stood on the far side of the trail, and the other stood directly in front of me, blocking my way. If I wanted to escape, I'd have to go back. I wasn't too worried, though, so I just stood still, waiting for one of them to say something. After a tense silence, I saw one guy nod to the other. Before I knew it, I was knocked to the ground. I lifted my head, dazed, but I knew I'd been hit. I hadn't even managed to get back up when one of them grabbed me from behind and started dragging me through the brush off the trail. I tried to resist, but I was still disoriented from the blow, and with two of them, it was useless. It happened so fast I couldn't make sense of it all. After dragging me for a minute, they stopped. We were still in sight of the trail, but no one else was around, so it didn't make sense to scream. I stayed quiet and conserved my energy. Then the men started kicking me. The pain was bad, but the worst part was knowing that my life was in their hands. For a moment, they stopped. I was lying there, aching, when I looked up and saw one of them pull out a knife and step closer. But the other guy stopped him, grabbing his arm. "No, get a rock," he said. The knife was put away, and they both turned away from me. This was my chance to escape. I crawled away as quietly as I could. When I looked back, they were still facing away from me. There were some small bushes and trees nearby, so I made my way there and hid, making no sound. I could hear them talking, and I knew they were looking for me, but they never came too close. Felt like they searched for a while, but eventually, they seemed to leave. I didn't move from my hiding place for over an hour, too scared to come out. When I did, I had to decide which direction to go. The last thing I wanted was to run into them again. I saw footprints on the trail going both ways, which meant they must have continued forward, so I decided to head back the way I came. I was badly beaten, but the adrenaline kept me moving quickly. The thought of spending the night out there crossed my mind, but somehow, I made it back to town before dark. I was exhausted, but I made it. When I got back to the hostel, my friends saw me and almost passed out. I had a large gash on my face, and one of my eyes was badly swollen. After cleaning up, we called the police, but I have no idea if they ever caught the men. We left the area just a few days later, and without me around to follow up, the police probably had to drop the case. In hindsight, I wish I had done more to make sure they were caught. I'm convinced that day could have been my last, and I barely escaped. I was driving to a job site one early morning, working as a pipeline technician in northern Alberta, Canada. My job often took me to isolated places. Typically, we'd go out in teams, but this morning I was by myself. It was the late 1990s before GPS, but I was skilled at reading maps and navigating the rough logging roads. I had been doing this job for about 4 years, and I was 28 at the time. My truck was built for these bumpy, off-road highways. The road I was on was unpaved but in decent condition, especially considering how remote it was. It was one of the main routes in the area, and I had been driving on it for over 2 hours, deep in the woods. Since it was off-season for logging, I didn't expect to see anyone, but it was a public road, so people could be out there for various reasons. It had been hours since I saw another vehicle. Then, on the right side of the road, I spotted a figure in the distance. I gently tapped the brakes, slowing down, and grabbed my radio to report what I'd seen. It was standard procedure, but I knew it was unlikely anyone would respond. As I got closer, the man waved as though asking me to stop. We were far into the woods, and I thought he might be in trouble, so I figured I should help. I stopped next to him without pulling over completely. As soon as I rolled down the window, he quickly explained that he had crashed his car a few miles back, and his wife was hurt. He seemed sincere and genuinely worried, almost on the verge of tears. It was hard to fake that level of distress, so I believed him. There was no way to quickly call for help, so I agreed to give him a ride. We turned the truck around and started heading back. He explained that he had been driving with his wife when they ran into a ditch. She wasn't wearing her seatbelt, and her head hit the dashboard. The truck got stuck, but he seemed unharmed. His story sounded reasonable, so I believed him. About 20 minutes down the road, He directed me to take a right turn onto a narrow, bumpy side road. I took it slow, even though I was in a hurry. Eventually, I saw the truck he'd mentioned. However, it didn't look like it had crashed. It was fine, just stuck in a relatively shallow ditch. The vehicle looked like something that could easily be pulled out, and it didn't seem to be in any serious trouble. That's when I started feeling suspicious. I stopped about 15 meters behind the truck and put the vehicle in park. I glanced at the man in the passenger seat without saying anything. After a long pause, he asked if I was going to get out. I told him that if his wife really was injured, he would get out and help her. But he didn't move, which only made me more suspicious. I realized that if I got out, he might have other people waiting to jump me. We both stayed seated in silence for a while, the tension building. Finally, I broke the silence with a vague question. "So, what are you going to do?" I wasn't accusing him directly, but wanted to see his reaction. He stuck to his story, saying his wife was in the truck, lying in the back seat. I told him to go get her and bring her here, but I made it clear I wasn't getting out of the truck. I even offered to move closer, but I wasn't leaving the vehicle. The man nodded, unbuckled his seatbelt, and opened the truck door. When he stepped out, he left the door open. I was still on edge, so I quickly locked the door and pulled it shut. As he walked toward his truck, I watched carefully. He turned around when he heard the door click shut, but I had to make sure there wasn't anyone in real need of help. I figured there was maybe a 10% chance of that, so I kept watching. Just as I expected, 3 men appeared from behind the truck, running toward me. My truck was still facing them, so I couldn't escape in that direction. Going forward would only take me deeper into the woods. 2 of the men were holding tools, probably metal pipes. I feared they were planning to smash my truck. I started the engine and revved it loudly as a warning. I was ready to defend myself if I had to. They kept coming, so I put the truck in gear and sped toward them. One of them barely jumped out of the way, and the other was far enough that I missed him. I quickly shifted into reverse and backed away. Once I was a good distance down the road, I turned around and headed back toward the main road. I didn't think they followed me in their truck, but I couldn't be sure. Their vehicle might have really been broken down, though I doubted it. My only way to communicate out there was through my long-range radio. I called in and explained what happened, though I knew the men who set me up were probably listening. It would have been creepy if they had responded, but they didn't. Knowing they were out there, I decided it wasn't safe to go to the job site that day. I didn't want to risk running into them again. When I got back to town, I went straight to the police station. The spot where it happened was over 3 hours away, so I knew it was unlikely they'd still be there. The police sent someone out, but I wasn't optimistic about finding anything. I was right. They were never caught. After that day, I realized how dangerous it could be to be alone in the woods. It's pretty crazy to be out there without a weapon, so I started carrying a firearm in my work truck. My company allowed it, and many of my coworkers already carried. I did that job for nearly 20 more years, and fortunately, I never had to use it. I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online security service that helps you scan and remove your personal information from various online sources, including scam sites, the dark web, and data brokers. These groups profit from your private data, making it essential to eliminate your information from their reach. Aura makes this process as simple as possible. I signed up in minutes, and with just a few clicks, Aura scanned and removed my personal data. They notified me about multiple places across the internet where my information, like my full name, phone number, and address, was found. Without Aura, I never would have known. Aura keeps monitoring my data, alerting me to any new threats and helping me resolve them quickly. It also offers a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, securing all your connected devices. In today's world, Identity and data theft are unfortunately common, affecting millions every year, causing significant financial losses. With Aura, you can have peace of mind, knowing your personal information is protected. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the QR code. During this trial, you can find out if your personal data has been compromised, remove it from major platforms, and securely monitor your identity. I highly recommend giving this free trial a try to see if your information has been exposed and to keep your identity safe. Thanks to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. My friend and I lived in a small town near Seattle. Over the past few years, we had gotten really into camping and hiking, but there was something about setting up camp and living among the wildlife that felt different from just hiking. In the spring of 2021, we planned a camping trip not far from home. However, with our work schedules being mismatched, it took a little while to figure out the right days to go. A few days before the trip, my manager had to push back my days off by one day, which messed up our plans. I told my friend, who I'll call Brandon, and he said it was no big deal. He would hike out there and set up camp, spending the first night alone. He insisted he would enjoy it, so I didn't stop him. He let me know when he arrived and set up everything, and it seemed fine. The next morning, I drove out to the campsite. This wasn't a common sight, as there were many others around, but it still had a cleared area and a good trail for campers. It wasn't just a random spot in the woods. I texted Brandon while on my way, but lost service before I got a reply. Along the hike, my phone picked up service a few times, but I still hadn't received any messages from him. I thought maybe it was a service issue or my phone was glitching, but there were a lot of possible explanations. When I arrived, something was off. Brandon wasn't there. I checked the tent and surrounding area but couldn't find him. I wasn't too worried, though. I knew there were a few places he could have gone, like a nearby river for fishing or a few trails with nice views. He could be anywhere. I put my bag down, set up my tent, and started a fire to warm up some canned food. It was only noon, so I figured if he had gone to the river or a trail, he wouldn't be back until at least 3 o'clock or 4 p.m. But by 5 p.m., I started to get anxious. I looked around for any signs of where he might have gone, but there were so many shoe prints, I couldn't tell where he'd headed. My phone still had no service, and I couldn't reach him. My only choice was to stay put and hope he would return. It was getting dark, and hiking out now seemed risky. I added more wood to the fire, sat down, and tried to relax, but a deep unease settled in. I didn't know if he was lost, hurt, or just enjoying a longer hike. Then, I saw a light flicker through the trees ahead. It moved like someone was walking with it, and it was near one of the trails. I felt some relief, thinking it must be Brandon. The light got brighter and closer, and I could hear footsteps. But just before I expected to see who it was, the light went out, and the footsteps stopped. "Brandon," I called out. Silence. No movement, no response. My heart raced, and I called out again. "Brandon? Who's out there?" Still nothing. The silence grew, making my stomach churn with anxiety. I stared into the darkness, listening intently for over an hour, hearing nothing but the sounds of the forest. I never heard anyone leave, but I could feel someone was still out there, watching me. I quickly started packing up my things, moving fast but constantly checking behind me. Something told me to get out and find help, so that's exactly what I did. I don't think I was followed, but I made it out without any more problems. The police couldn't help until the next day. When they returned to the site, everything was as I'd left it, but Brandon was still missing. They found traces of him on a trail, leading deeper into the woods. There were more shoe prints, this time from another person next to his. Unfortunately, Brandon was never found, and the case went cold after a few days. It's believed that he was likely taken by the person I encountered. It's awful to think that things could have turned out differently if I had gone with him on the first day. Maybe I, too, would have disappeared. I went camping in a forest I knew well, not far from my home in Colorado. I lived a few hours away, but I made the trip every few months when the weather was nice. I'd already set up camp and had been there for 2 days. During that time, I focused on getting the tent set up properly and spent some time fishing, not doing much else. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike north from my campsite. There were no trails, so I just made my way partway up the mountain, heading in a general direction. I knew the landmarks around my camp well and had everything I needed to avoid getting lost, so I was enjoying the hike. It was a little past noon when I noticed smoke rising behind me. It looked like it was coming from near my campsite. I moved around to get a better view, and it seemed like something was burning either at my campsite or close by. I hurried back, worried about what it could be, but I knew I hadn't left a fire burning. I wasn't sure what was happening. When I got within a 1/4 of a mile of where the smoke was coming from, I could tell it wasn't directly from my camp. I made it back to my campsite and everything was fine. The smoke was coming from nearby, but I couldn't see what it was. I considered going to check it out, but the only thing it could be was another campfire. It was odd that someone else was out there in the same area I was, especially since there were no trails leading to this spot. Still, I didn't want to run into anyone, so I stayed at my campsite. I didn't think much of it at first, just went about my day. An hour or so later, I looked around and froze when I saw a man standing in the woods. He was so still, it was like he was just staring at me. I had no idea how long he'd been there. I waved my arm nervously, but he didn't wave back. He was too far away to tell if he was actually watching me, but he was facing my campsite. After a moment, I went back to what I was doing, but I kept glancing at him. He stayed in the same spot for nearly 15 minutes before disappearing. That really unsettled me. There was no reason for someone to be acting like that. I stayed alert for the next few hours, keeping an eye on my surroundings. Finally, I walked over to where I had seen the man standing. I wanted to see if there was something there that might explain his presence, but there was nothing. It was just more forest. I went back to my camp as the sun began to set, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking it all. But the more I thought about it, the more creeped out I became. By the time night fell, I hadn't seen anything else. I sat outside my tent, watching the fire, unsure of how much time had passed. After a while, I noticed a flickering light to my left. It was another campfire, but it wasn't in the direction where I'd seen the smoke earlier. It was near where I had seen the man. I stood up, feeling that same unease building again. When I looked closer, I could make out the base of the fire, but there was no one around it. I scanned the dark forest, and then I saw something else. Behind a bush, maybe 10 or 15 feet away, I saw a face staring back at me. My heart raced in fear, and for a few seconds I just froze. The figure didn't seem to know I could see him. He was looking back at me but stayed perfectly still. I stepped back behind my campfire, keeping my eyes on him. The next 30 minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Felt like time was moving slowly. Finally, I saw the figure start to move. He crouched low and slowly made his way further into the forest, eventually disappearing into the darkness. I stayed alert for the rest of the night, constantly scanning the area, but I didn't see anything else. When daylight began to break, I packed up my things and left, walking quickly to my car. Whatever was happening out there felt too suspicious, and I felt like staying any longer could put me in danger. I'm Josh, and this took place in the early 2000s, not long after my wife, Claire, and I got married. We met in college, and after graduating, we began making plans for the wedding. We ended up tying the knot before either of us had steady careers, so our families were covering a lot of the costs. We didn't have the money for a proper honeymoon, so we thought we'd save up and do something special within a few years. However, Claire's family owned a cabin not far from where we lived, only a few hours' drive. It was a beautiful place, and I'd been there once before. The cabin sat on 5 acres, surrounded by public land, so it was peaceful and private. After our wedding, Claire and I drove there in my old Honda Accord. It wasn't much to look at, but it still ran well. We got there in the early evening on a Saturday, just after the sun had set. We planned to stay for almost a week, giving us time to unwind. That first night, we just stayed inside and went to bed fairly early. The next day and the day after that were quiet, but one evening, as the sun was going down, I was sitting on the porch, one of 2 chairs there. I noticed smoke rising about 200 yards ahead. It seemed to be coming from within our property, which concerned me. I decided to check it out, so I called to my wife, letting her know I'd be back soon, and set off in the direction of the smoke. There was no clear path in that direction, so I started by walking along the road, which kind of went the same way. I could keep the smoke in sight as I went. I figured someone might have wandered onto the land by mistake, thinking it was part of the public property. That happens sometimes, and usually it's not a big issue. Still, Claire's parents had asked us to let campers know it was private property. When I reached the point where the smoke was rising, I had to head off the road and into the woods. I lost sight of the smoke there, but tried to keep moving in a straight line. Eventually, I found the spot. It was a smoldering log with some scattered trash around. Clearly, someone had been there recently. I wandered around for a few minutes, calling out in case they were nearby, but got no reply. Unsure what else to do, I decided to head back to the cabin to check on Claire. I'd been gone for about 20 minutes and didn't want her to start worrying. I kicked some dirt onto the remains of the fire to put it out, then started heading back. As I made my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt strange. The forest was unusually quiet, and I still didn't know where that person had gone. When I got back to the cabin and climbed the steps, I saw that the front door was wide open. I stepped inside and saw a man standing in the living room, holding my wife from behind. His clothes were dirty and ragged, like he'd been living outdoors. My wife's eyes were wide with fear, but she kept calm given the situation. I knew I had to stay calm, too. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked. He didn't respond, just stared at me. I noticed he was trembling slightly, which made me even more nervous. "Please, just let her go," I said, taking a step closer. "We don't want trouble. We can help you if you need something." He looked at me, then at my wife, and for a second, it seemed like he might consider what I said. But that was probably just wishful thinking. I held my breath, hoping he'd release her. Then, without warning, Claire elbowed him hard in the ribs. He gasped and loosened his grip just enough for her to break free. We dashed out of the cabin and jumped into the car. I pulled the keys from my pocket, got the engine started, and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the man behind. It was nearly dark, so we relied on the headlights to guide us. We didn't stop driving until we reached the closest town, about 20 miles away. Both of us were shaken but grateful to be safe. We went straight to the police station to report what happened, but since it was a small town, they didn't have the resources to go out that night. We spent the night at a small motel, though we couldn't sleep and mostly stayed up talking. Early the next morning, we returned to the cabin with the police. As we approached, I felt uneasy. Smoke was still rising in the distance. When we arrived, our worst fears were confirmed. The cabin was burned to the ground, reduced to a smoldering pile of ash and charred wood. The smell of burnt wood hung heavy in the air. My wife clung to my arm, tears in her eyes, as we stood in silence, watching her family cabin burn down. The police and fire crew investigated, but there wasn't much left to go on. The man had disappeared without a trace, and any evidence that could have helped identify him was likely lost in the fire. They confirmed that no human remains were found, so it seemed the man had escaped. We stayed with Claire's parents for a few days while figuring out our next steps. They were shocked and heartbroken by what happened, but relieved that we were safe. That was my first week as a married man, and fortunately, things have only improved for us since. The cabin was rebuilt a few years later, and her family sold it soon after. I've never bothered going back to the new one. This happened to me and my nephew, Evan, around 8 years ago. Every summer since he started high school, I'd take him somewhere for a week when he was on break. My sister and her husband always appreciated the break, and they liked that Evan would get away from his phone for a bit. One year, we went on a road trip through the mountains, staying at some motels along the way. The year before, we camped at a state park. But this summer, I rented a cabin out in the woods. Based on the pictures and the online description, it looked like a pretty rugged cabin. It didn't have electricity or running water, which I knew could be tough for a week, but Evan was up for it, so I was too. I was 42, and Evan was 18. I packed up my car with everything we'd need before picking him up. Since there were no nearby stores, we had to bring enough food for the entire time. I didn't want to count on catching anything, even though there was a nice fishing spot on the property. I also brought along my firearm, as I always did when heading into the woods. I picked Evan up, and for the first hour, he barely looked up from his phone. He was constantly checking his notifications, probably catching up with friends or browsing the latest updates. I didn't mind too much, knowing that cell service would be gone soon enough, and he'd have no choice but to hang out with his favorite uncle. When we got to the cabin, I noticed an old truck parked outside, which was strange because we were supposed to have the place to ourselves. I parked a few spaces away and saw some papers on the dashboard. Before we even got out, a man stepped out of the cabin. He looked to be middle-aged, with worn jeans and a flannel shirt. I told Evan to wait in the car and got out to talk to the man. He quickly told me he worked for the cabin's owner and was finishing up some last-minute cleaning. I thanked him, and after a short chat, he climbed into his truck and left, kicking up dust as he drove off. The cabin turned out to be more spacious than I'd expected, with a cozy living area, a stone fireplace, and 2 small bedrooms. It wasn't luxurious, but it did seem bigger than the pictures had shown. Evan claimed the room with the better view, leaving me the one with a smaller window looking out at the trees. I could have insisted, but he called it, and that was that. We took a short walk around the property, but came back when it started getting dark. Nothing unusual happened that night or the next day, but on the evening after that, we were in the living room chatting after dinner. Evan would check his phone now and then, surprisingly getting a bit of service. It was like his phone was a lifeline. He'd pick it up every chance he got. Eventually, he put it down, and we continued our conversation. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, which startled us. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was far off. I got up cautiously to answer. It was pitch dark outside, and we only had oil lamps inside, so it was hard to see. When I opened the door, there stood the same man from the truck, looking a bit uneasy and shifting on his feet. "Sorry to bother you so late," he said, sounding nervous. "I just need to check the gas line inside." I wasn't sure about it, but eventually let him in. As he walked past me, I started second-guessing my choice, sensing something wasn't right. Evan, who had been quiet, pulled out his phone. The man headed toward the kitchen, appearing to mess with something under the sink. Evan leaned over and whispered, "I just messaged the owner. There's no maintenance guy." That got my attention. I glanced at the man, who seemed to be rifling through the kitchen cabinets. I got up, went to my room, and grabbed my gun, tucking it under my shirt before coming back to the living room, hoping I'd have no reason to use it. After a few minutes, I went into the kitchen to check on him. "Everything all right in here?" I asked. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. His eyes flicked down to my shirt where the gun was just barely visible. His expression changed for a brief second, but I caught it. "Yeah, all done. Just wrapping up," he replied, clearly eager to leave. "I think it's best if you go now," I told him, resting my hand on my belt. We weren't told about any maintenance tonight, and the owner said no one was supposed to stop by. He didn't argue. He nodded, muttered something under his breath, and walked to the door. I made sure he left the property and locked the door behind him. To this day, I'm not sure what his intentions were, whether he planned to steal something or something worse. But I often wonder how differently things might have gone if I hadn't brought my firearm. I have two close friends from back when I was younger, Tim and Alex. We stayed tight all through school and college, but after that, I moved to a town roughly 2 hours away. We still managed to see each other about once a month, though it was nothing like it used to be. I had gotten married the year before this story took place, and that year I hadn't met up with them much. That summer, Alex suggested a camping trip. He and I didn't have much experience with the outdoors, but Tim went a few times a year with his dad, so he was the one guiding us. Tim handled all the planning, saying we'd go to a spot not far from where he and his dad had camped before. This particular area, he mentioned, had only been open to the public for a short time, so it was still fairly quiet. Tim gathered all the gear we'd need, except for our personal stuff. I decided to bring my own tent since I like having some personal space, but Tim and Alex would share, given Tim had a massive, old canvas tent that he often used for colder trips. Since we'd have car access at the site, the extra weight wasn't an issue. We loaded everything into Tim's truck and headed out together. I left my car at his place, planning to pick it up on the way back. It was about a 5-hour drive, and I hadn't seen scenery like that in years. There's something special about leaving the city every so often. It just clears your mind. We got there late in the afternoon, feeling eager. We quickly unloaded and set up the big tent first. Took 2 people, so I stood to the side, giving directions. Once that was up, we tossed our stuff inside and took a little walk. My tent was easy to put together, so there was no rush. There weren't assigned spots at this site, but one large clearing made the most sense for camping, with a few old fire pits marking different areas. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not. After exploring a bit, we found a stream, which was marked on the map. It was about 5 feet wide, with a strong current that could pull someone if they weren't careful, so I knew we'd need to watch out when refilling water. Tim assured us the water was safe to drink, so I mentally noted that. We headed back to our camp, and while Tim and Alex finished setting things up, I went to gather firewood. It wasn't too hard to find decent pieces, so soon enough my arms were full. As I made my way back, arms loaded with sticks, I noticed a guy setting up a worn-out tent nearby. His tent was in rough shape, full of holes and tears. I was a bit annoyed we wouldn't have the place to ourselves, but it was public land, and he had every right to be there. I gave him a quick nod and moved on, eager to get back to my friends and start a fire before it got too chilly. When I returned, I quietly said to Tim, "Looks like we're not alone." Tim, who had hoped we'd have the place to ourselves, wasn't thrilled. We saw the man setting up about 100 feet away. He hung a tarp over his tent, which was smart, then disappeared into the woods, probably looking for firewood like I had. I didn't pay much attention to him after that. Once night fell, we got a fire going, and the stars filled the sky. We each sat in one of those camp chairs with cup holders, a beer in hand, chatting and relaxing. As time went by, I realized the man hadn't come back. His tent sat empty in the dark, but he was nowhere around. Alex thought he might be asleep, but Tim was sure he hadn't returned. His seat faced that direction, and he hadn't seen any movement. "Strange that he's not back yet," I said, glancing at the empty tent. We kept talking, but a part of me couldn't stop glancing over, wondering when or if he'd come back. Hours passed, and I couldn't help but wonder what he was doing in the woods all this time. Eventually, the fire died down to embers, and we decided to call it a night. It was well after midnight, and I was feeling pretty tired. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. As I stepped out of my tent, the chilly air made me zip up my jacket. The man's tent was still just as it had been, flap closed, and no sign of him. Still not back, I muttered to myself, noticing my friends were still asleep. After about half an hour, I woke them up, and we had a quick breakfast by the fire pit. "Think he's in there?" I asked, pointing to the tent. "I don't think so," Tim replied. "We'd have heard him come back." After we ate, our curiosity got the best of us, so we decided to check his camp. We approached slowly, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But got no answer. Up close, the tent was as run down as it had looked, and peeking through one of the holes, we saw only a few belongings. A backpack, a rolled-up sleeping bag, and an old pair of boots. It seemed he'd planned to return. Around the tent, there were several cigarette butts, though we couldn't tell how fresh they were. We spent the next few hours searching the nearby area, calling out and looking for any trace of him, but he seemed to have vanished without a trace. By noon, after hours of fruitless searching, we were all growing worried. We returned to our camp, tired and uneasy. "We should probably call for help," Tim finally suggested, and we all agreed. We packed up our gear in a rush and loaded everything into the truck, skipping the usual careful packing. Suddenly, it felt urgent, and it was. The drive to the nearest ranger station felt much longer than it had the day before, even though Tim was speeding. Once we got there, we reported what we'd seen: the abandoned tent, cigarette butts, and the man who'd gone missing. The rangers assured us they'd send a team out to search the area and asked us to stay reachable, but they allowed us to go home. Weeks went by, and the mystery remained unsolved. No new clues turned up, and the man was never found. It's sad to think about, but sometimes things go wrong out in the wild, and nature has its own way of erasing signs. Tim, who sometimes puts out trail cameras on his trips, often captures surprising visitors. Wolves, coyotes, bears, all common around here. If you ask me, I think the guy went to fill his bottle at the stream, maybe slipped, and the fast current pulled him under. Between the rushing water and the wildlife, he might never be found. It's a harsh thought, but I think that's what happened to him. Rest in peace.